They say the phone always rings at 3 in the morning when your world is about to end. Mine rang at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in October, and the voice on the other end changed everything I thought I knew about love, family, and the lengths people will go to for money. Before I tell you what happened next, I need you to do something for me. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching this from, because what I'm about to share with you is going to make you question everyone you trust. And trust me, after living through this nightmare, I've learned that the people closest to you can be the most dangerous of all. My name is Ruth, and I'm 72 years old. I've buried 2 husbands, raised 4 children, and thought I'd seen every kind of heartbreak life could throw at me. I was wrong. Dead wrong. The voice belonged to Detective Martinez from the county sheriff's office. My son Daniel, my baby, my youngest at 43, had been found dead in his home office. Heart attack, they said. Sudden cardiac arrest. No signs of foul play, just a healthy man in his prime who dropped dead at his desk while working late. I remember the phone slipping from my hand, clattering against the hardwood floor of my small apartment. The sound echoed through the darkness like a gunshot. Daniel. My Daniel. The son who called me every Sunday without fail, who brought me soup when I had the flu, who never forgot my birthday or Mother's Day. Gone. The detective's voice continued speaking from somewhere near my feet, but I couldn't make out the words. All I could hear was the rushing of blood in my ears and the sound of my own ragged breathing. This couldn't be happening. Not to Daniel. Not to my boy. But here's the thing about grief, it makes you stupid. It makes you vulnerable. And it makes you trust people you should never, ever trust. I threw on the first clothes I could find and drove the 4 to 7 minutes to Daniel's house in complete silence. No radio, no thoughts, just the hypnotic rhythm of my wipers against a light rain that had started to fall. The house, a beautiful colonial that Daniel had worked so hard to afford, was lit up like Christmas morning. Police cars, an ambulance, neighbors gathered on their front porches whispering behind their hands. That's when I saw her. Cassie. My daughter-in-law of 8 years, standing in the driveway in a silk robe and matching slippers, her blonde hair perfect despite the early hour. She wasn't crying. That should have been my first red flag, but grief, like I said, makes you blind to things that should be obvious. She saw me approaching and immediately collapsed into my arms, sobbing. Her tears felt warm against my shoulder, and for a moment, just a moment, I thought we were going to get through this together. 2 women who loved Daniel more than life itself, supporting each other through the unthinkable. How naive I was. The funeral was 3 days later. I'd helped plan every detail, from the flowers to the music to the readings. Daniel would have loved it, simple, dignified, filled with stories about his kindness and his terrible jokes that somehow always made you laugh anyway. Cassie played the grieving widow perfectly. Designer black dress, tasteful tears, gracious acceptance of condolences. She even held my hand during the service. But I noticed things. Small things. Like how she kept checking her phone during the eulogy. Like how she seemed more concerned with the catering arrangements than with the actual service. Like how she pulled the funeral director aside for what looked like a heated conversation about something. If you've ever lost someone you love more than your own life, you know that grief comes in waves. Sometimes you're fine, functioning normally, and then suddenly you're drowning in it. That's what happened to me the day after the funeral. I woke up in my empty apartment, reached for the phone to call Daniel like I did every morning, and reality crashed over me like a tsunami. I drove to his house, their house, because I needed to feel close to him. I needed to sit in his favorite chair and smell his cologne and pretend, just for a few minutes, that he might walk through the door. Cassie welcomed me with open arms. She made coffee, brought out photo albums, and we spent the afternoon reminiscing about Daniel's childhood, his college years, the early days of their marriage. That was the day she asked me to move in. I can't bear to be alone in this house, she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Everything reminds me of him. And you're all I have left of Daniel. Please, Ruth. I need you here. What could I say? My own apartment felt like a tomb. The silence was killing me. And she was right. She was all I had left of my son, and I was all she had left of him. We needed each other. So I moved in that weekend, bringing just a few suitcases of clothes and some pictures of Daniel from when he was little. Cassie helped me set up in the guest room, the one with the big windows that looked out over the garden Daniel had loved so much. It felt right, being there. It felt like coming home. The first few weeks were almost comfortable. We fell into a routine. Morning coffee together, sharing memories of Daniel, taking care of the endless paperwork that follows a death. Cassie handled most of the legal stuff. She was Daniel's wife, after all, and she had power of attorney. I was grateful not to have to deal with lawyers and insurance companies and banks. Grief had left me exhausted, and she seemed so capable, so organized. I should have paid more attention to those phone calls she took behind closed doors. I should have wondered why she was meeting with Daniel's business partners so often. I should have asked more questions when she started talking about restructuring and maximizing assets. But like I said, grief makes you stupid. The first crack in the facade appeared about a month after the funeral. I was in the kitchen making dinner when Cassie came in, phone pressed to her ear, talking in low, urgent tones. She didn't see me at first, and I caught fragments of her conversation. "No, the old lady is still here. I know, but I can't just kick her out yet. Trust me, once the will is read, it won't matter." Old lady. That's what she called me. Her voice was cold, calculating, nothing like the grieving daughter-in-law who had been leaning on me for support. When she noticed me standing there, she quickly ended the call and put on her sad smile. "Sorry, honey. Just dealing with some of Daniel's business stuff. You know how complicated these things can get." I nodded and went back to chopping vegetables, but something had shifted. A seed of doubt had been planted, and it was already starting to grow. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention. The phone calls that always ended when I entered a room. The meetings with men in expensive suits who looked at me like I was invisible. The way Cass's grief seemed to turn on and off like a switch depending on who was around. And then there were the papers. Stacks and stacks of legal documents that she kept in Daniel's home office, the room where he had died. She'd lock the door when she was in there, something she'd never done before. When I asked about it, she said she was just trying to preserve Daniel's memory and didn't want anyone disturbing his things. But I knew my son. Daniel was the most trusting person alive, sometimes to a fault. He believed in people, gave them the benefit of the doubt, always looked for the good in everyone. It's what made him such a successful businessman. People wanted to work with him because they knew he was honest and fair. It's also what made him vulnerable. I started to wonder what exactly Cassie was hiding in that office. What papers was she so desperate to keep secret? And why did she keep mentioning the will reading, which had been scheduled for 2 months after Daniel's death to allow time for all the legal paperwork to be processed? The doubt was eating at me, but I didn't know what to do about it. Cassie was still playing the loving daughter-in-law during the day, still asking my opinion about redecorating decisions and still bringing me cups of tea when I looked sad. But at night, I could hear her on the phone, her voice sharp and businesslike, discussing things I didn't understand. That's when I made a decision that would change everything. I decided to start keeping a journal, documenting every conversation, every phone call I overheard, every meeting Cassie had. If something was wrong, I wanted to have proof. If I was just being a paranoid old woman, then at least I'd have evidence of my own foolishness. I had no idea that this simple decision would eventually save my life and expose a conspiracy that went deeper than I ever could have imagined. The journal started innocently enough. Just notes about Cass's behavior, times and dates of phone calls, names of people who came to the house. But as the entries accumulated, a pattern began to emerge. A very disturbing pattern. The first real warning sign came on a Thursday morning in November, exactly 6 weeks after Daniel's funeral. I was in the garden, pulling weeds from the flower bed Daniel had planted the spring before he died, when I heard Cass's voice drifting through the open office window. She was on the phone, and she wasn't being careful about keeping her voice down. "The insurance money cleared yesterday. $2 million. Just like we planned. No, she still doesn't suspect anything. Look, Trevor, I know what I'm doing. The old bet trusts me completely." Trevor. I'd heard that name before, whispered in late-night phone calls and mentioned in hushed conversations with those men in expensive suits. But hearing Cassie talk about insurance money, Daniel's life insurance, made my blood run cold. $2 million. I had no idea Daniel had that much coverage. When had he taken out such a large policy? And why was Cassie talking about it like they had planned something? I crouched lower among the rose bushes, my heart hammering against my ribs. Cassie continued talking, her voice filled with a confidence I'd never heard before. "The will reading is in 2 weeks. Once that's done and she realizes she's getting nothing, I'll find a way to get her out of here. Maybe I'll tell her the house needs major repairs and isn't safe for someone her age. She'll believe it, she believes everything I tell her." Getting nothing? But Daniel had always told me I was in his will. Not that we'd discuss specifics, it felt too morbid, but he'd mentioned it several times over the years. "Don't worry about money, Mom," he'd say whenever I fretted about my small pension. "I've made sure you'll be taken care of." I stayed in that garden for 3 hours, dirt under my fingernails, thorns scratching my arms, trying to process what I'd heard. Part of me wanted to march into that house and confront Cassie directly. But another part, the part that had learned hard lessons from 72 years of living, told me to be smart, to be careful, to figure out exactly what I was dealing with before I made any moves. That night, I added everything to my journal, including a detailed account of the phone conversation. I also started a new section, questions. Who was Trevor? When had Daniel increased his life insurance? Why was Cassie so confident I wouldn't inherit anything? And what did she mean by "just like we planned"? If you've ever had that sinking feeling in your gut when you realize someone you trusted has been lying to you, you know how I felt. But this was worse than a normal betrayal. This was about my son, my dead son, and the woman who was supposed to be mourning him alongside me. The next few days were a masterclass in acting. I had to pretend everything was normal while watching Cassie for any signs of what she was really up to. She continued to play the grieving widow during our morning coffee sessions, talking about how much she missed Daniel and how grateful she was to have me there for support. But now I noticed things I'd missed before. Like how she never actually talked about specific memories of Daniel. It was always generic stuff about how wonderful and loving he was. Like how she changed the subject whenever I brought up their early relationship or their wedding. Like how she kept all the sympathy cards and flowers in the living room where visitors could see them, but threw away any personal items of Daniel's that had real emotional value. She was performing grief, not feeling it. The breakthrough came when I was helping Cassie clean out Daniel's closet. She decided it was time to move forward and donate his clothes to charity. I was folding his shirts that still smelled like his cologne, when I found something in one of the pockets. A business card. Trevor Hawkins, private investigator, it read, with a phone number and an address downtown. Private investigator? Why would Daniel have been working with a private investigator? I slipped the card into my own pocket when Cassie wasn't looking and continued folding clothes like nothing had happened. That evening, after Cassie had gone to bed, I called the number on the card. It rang 4 times before a gruff voice answered. Hawkins Investigations. Mr. Hawkins? My name is Ruth Chen. I found your card among my son's belongings. Daniel Chen? He passed away about 2 months ago. There was a long pause. When Hawkins spoke again, his voice was careful, professional. I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Chen. Daniel was a good man. Were you working for him? Another pause. I'm not sure how much I can tell you over the phone. Could we meet somewhere? There are some things about your son's death that, well, there are some things you should know. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone. What kind of things? Not over the phone. Can you meet me tomorrow afternoon? There's a diner on Maple Street, Murphy's. Do you know it? I knew it. Daniel used to take me there for pancakes when he was in high school. 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock. And Mrs. Chen? Don't tell anyone about this call. Anyone. The line went dead, and I sat in the dark guest room, staring at the business card in my trembling hands. What had Daniel gotten himself into? And what did this private investigator know about his death? I barely slept that night. Every sound in the house made me jump. Footsteps in the hallway, the settling of old wood, the hum of the refrigerator. When I did doze off, I had nightmares about Daniel, about phone calls in the dark, about insurance money and wills and secrets buried in locked offices. The next morning, Cassie was unusually cheerful at breakfast. She'd made pancakes, Daniel's favorite, and was chattering about plans to redecorate the living room. Something lighter, she said, more contemporary. Daniel was always so traditional in his tastes. The casual dismissal of my son's preferences made my stomach turn, but I nodded and smiled and ate my pancakes like a good little old lady who didn't suspect a thing. At 1:30, I told Cassie I was going to the grocery store and would be back in a few hours. She barely looked up from her magazine. Drive safe, honey. Take your time. Murphy's Diner looked exactly the same as it had 20 years ago. Red vinyl booths, black and white checkered floors, a jukebox in the corner that probably still played the same songs. I spotted Trevor Hawkins immediately. He was exactly what you'd expect a private investigator to look like, mid-50s, grey hair, tired eyes, wearing a rumpled suit that had seen better days. He was sitting in a corner booth, drinking coffee and reading a newspaper. When I approached, he stood up and offered his hand. "Mrs. Chen? Trevor Hawkins. Thank you for coming." I slid into the booth across from him, my heart pounding. Up close, I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged like he was carrying a heavy weight. "Mr. Hawkins, I need to know what you know about my son. About Daniel." He signaled the waitress for another coffee and leaned back in his seat, studying my face. "How much did Daniel tell you about his marriage?" The question caught me off guard. "His marriage? What do you mean? Did he ever mention having problems with Cassie? Money issues? Trust issues? Anything like that?" I shook my head slowly. "No, never. They seemed happy. I mean, they'd been trying to have children for a few years, and I know that was difficult for them, but otherwise." I trailed off, thinking back over the past few years. Had there been signs I'd missed? "Mrs. Chen, your son hired me 3 months before he died. He suspected Cassie was having an affair." The words hit me like a physical blow. An affair. Sweet, trusting Daniel had suspected his wife of cheating on him? "Are you sure? That doesn't sound like." He was sure enough to hire me to follow her. And he was right. Hawkins pulled out a manila envelope and slid it across the table. I documented everything. The affair had been going on for almost 2 years. With shaking hands, I opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of photographs. Cassie and a man I didn't recognize, holding hands outside a restaurant. Kissing in the parking lot of a hotel. Entering an apartment building together. The timestamps showed dates going back months and months. "Who is he?" I whispered. "His name is Marcus Webb. He's a financial advisor. And according to my investigation, he's been helping Cassie move money around, setting up accounts, making investments. Your son's money, Mrs. Chen. They've been planning this for a long time." Planning this. The same phrase Cassie had used on the phone about the insurance money. Planning what exactly? "I think you know." His voice was gentle but firm. Daniel's death was very convenient for them. 2 million in life insurance, plus whatever he left in the will, plus the house, plus his business interests. We're talking about a lot of money, Mrs. Chen. The diner seemed to spin around me. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady myself. Are you suggesting they killed him?" "I can't prove that. But I can tell you that Daniel called me the night before he died. He said he'd found something, some documents that proved what Cassie and Marcus were up to. He was going to confront her the next morning. The next morning he was found dead. The next morning he was found dead." I stared at the photographs scattered across the table, evidence of betrayal, of a conspiracy, of a love story that had been nothing but lies. My son, my trusting, loving son, had died thinking his wife had been faithful to him. He'd died never knowing the extent of her deception. What do I do? The question came out as barely a whisper. Trevor Hawkins leaned forward, his eyes intense. "You be very, very careful. If I'm right about what happened to Daniel, then you could be in danger too. Especially if they think you know something or if you're in the way of their plans. The will reading is in 10 days. Then we have 10 days to figure out how to stop them." As I drove home that afternoon, my mind was reeling with everything I'd learned. Cassie wasn't just a grieving widow, she was a calculating murderer who had been playing me for a fool. The woman I'd been living with, the woman I'd been comforting, the woman who had held my hand at my son's funeral, had likely killed him for money. And I was sharing a house with her. Walking back into that house after meeting with Trevor felt like entering a lion's den. Everything looked the same, the family photos on the mantel, Daniel's reading chair by the window, the coffee cup Cassie had left on the kitchen counter. But now it all felt sinister, like props in an elaborate stage play designed to fool me. Cassie was in the living room, flipping through interior design magazines. She looked up when I came in, her face brightening with that practiced smile I now recognized as completely fake. "How was the grocery store, honey? You were gone longer than usual." "Traffic was terrible," I lied, setting down the bag of groceries I'd hastily purchased as an alibi. "And I ran into Mrs. Patterson from church. You know how she likes to talk." "Oh, that's nice. It's good for you to get out and socialize." She turned a page in her magazine, and I caught a glimpse of the article she was reading, 10 Ways to Maximize Your Home's Resale Value. Resale value. She was already planning to sell Daniel's house, the house he'd worked so hard to buy, the house where he'd hoped to raise children with the woman who'd probably killed him. That evening, I excused myself early and went to my room, claiming I had a headache. I needed time to process everything Trevor had told me and figure out my next move. I pulled out my journal and wrote down every detail from our meeting, including physical descriptions of the photographs and exact quotes from our conversation. As I wrote, I kept hearing Trevor's warning echoing in my mind, "You could be in danger too." Was I safe in this house? How far was Cassie willing to go to protect her secret? If she could kill Daniel, the man she'd promised to love and honor, what would she do to an old woman who might expose her? I was so lost in these dark thoughts that I almost missed the sound of Cassie's footsteps in the hallway outside my room. I quickly shoved the journal under my pillow and pretended to be asleep as her shadow paused outside my door. For what felt like an eternity, she just stood there. Was she listening? Was she debating whether to come in? Finally, I heard her move away toward her own bedroom, and I released the breath I'd been holding. But sleep was impossible that night. Every creak of the house, every distant car passing on the street, every whisper of wind through the trees sounded like a threat. The next morning brought a new shock. I came downstairs to find Cassie on the phone in the kitchen, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. When she saw me, she quickly ended the call. "Good morning, Ruth. I was just handling some insurance paperwork." But I'd heard enough of the conversation to catch a name, Marcus. She'd been talking to Marcus Webb, her lover, the man who'd been helping her steal Daniel's money. The man who might have helped her kill my son. "Everything okay with the insurance?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual as I poured myself coffee. "Oh, you know how these companies are. So much red tape. But it should all be resolved soon." She smiled that fake smile again. "Speaking of which, I should probably warn you, there might be some changes around here after the will reading next week." Changes. My heart started racing, but I forced myself to stay calm. What kind of changes? "Well, I've been thinking that this house is really too big for just the two of us. And with Daniel gone." She trailed off, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "I might need to downsize. Start fresh somewhere new, you know? Make a clean break from all the memories." She was setting the stage, preparing me for the moment when she'd kick me out and claim the house for herself. But something in her tone made me think there was more to it than that. "Of course," I said carefully. "I understand. This must be so difficult for you. You're such a blessing, Ruth. So understanding. Some mothers-in-law would make this whole situation so much harder." Mothers-in-law. The way she said it, like I was already part of her past, like I was already gone. That afternoon, while Cassie was out running errands, I did something I probably should have done weeks ago. I called Daniel's lawyer. "Whitman and Associates," a crisp voice answered. "Hello, this is Ruth Chen. My son Daniel was a client of Mr. Whitman's." "Daniel Chen? He passed away a couple months ago." "Oh yes, Mrs. Chen. I'm so sorry for your loss. How can I help you?" "I was wondering about the will reading. It's scheduled for next week, correct?" "That's correct. Tuesday at 2 o'clock. We sent the notice to Mrs. Chen, your daughter-in-law, but of course you're welcome to attend as well." Actually, I was hoping to speak with Mr. Whitman beforehand. About Daniel's estate. There are some concerns I have. There was a pause. What kind of concerns? I chose my words carefully. I'd prefer to discuss them in person, if possible. Could I make an appointment? Let me check his schedule. He could see you tomorrow at 10 a.m. Would that work? Perfect. And, this might sound paranoid, but I'd prefer if we kept this meeting confidential. Just between us. Another pause. Of course, Mrs. Chen. We'll see you tomorrow at 10. That night, I lay in bed listening to Cassie move around the house. She was restless, pacing from room to room, making phone calls that ended abruptly whenever I made any noise. I could hear the murmur of her voice through the walls, but couldn't make out words. Whatever she was planning, it was making her nervous. Around midnight, I heard her leave the house. A car door slammed, an engine started, and then silence. Where was she going at midnight? Meeting Marcus? Planning their next move? I considered following her, but decided it was too risky. If she caught me. She didn't come home until nearly 3 a.m., creeping through the house like she was trying not to wake me. But I was wide awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what kind of midnight business required such secrecy. The next morning, Cassie seemed different. More agitated, less careful about maintaining her grieving widow act. She barely spoke at breakfast, just sat there scrolling through her phone with a frown on her face. "I have some errands to run this morning," I announced, finishing my coffee. "Ham," she replied without looking up. "I might be gone a few hours." "That's fine." Her indifference was almost insulting. A month ago, she would have asked where I was going, if I needed anything from town, if I wanted company. Now she couldn't even pretend to care. The law offices of Whitman and Associates occupied the top floor of a historic building downtown. Mr. Whitman himself was a distinguished man in his 60s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. He led me into his office, which was lined with law books and family photographs. "Mrs. Chen, please have a seat. Coffee?" "No, thank you." I sat on the edge of the leather chair, my hands folded tightly in my lap. "Mr. Whitman, I need to ask you some questions about Daniel's will. I'm afraid there are limits to what I can discuss before the official reading, but I'll help however I can." Am I mentioned in the will?" He looked surprised. "You don't know." Daniel and I never discussed specifics. But he always said he'd made provisions for me, that I'd be taken care of. Mr. Whitman opened a file cabinet and pulled out a thick folder. He flipped through several pages before looking up at me with a puzzled expression. "Mrs. Chen, according to this document, you inherit everything." The words didn't register at first. "I'm sorry." "Your son's will leaves his entire estate to you. The house, his business interests, his investment accounts, everything. Mrs. Chen, Cassie, receives a small bequest, $10,000, but that's all." The room seemed to tilt. But that can't be right," Cassie said. "What did Cassie say?" I thought back to that overheard phone conversation. She seemed to think she would inherit everything. And she mentioned something about me getting nothing. Mr. Whitman frowned. "That's very strange. She was here just last week asking about the will." I couldn't give her specifics, but I did tell her that she was not the primary beneficiary. "She knows she's not inheriting." "She knows." My mind was racing. If Cassie knew she wasn't going to inherit Daniel's estate, why was she so confident about her financial future? Why was she making plans to sell the house? And why did she think I would be left with nothing? "Mr. Whitman, is it possible for someone to change a will after the person has died?" His expression grew serious. "Mrs. Chen, that would be fraud. A serious federal crime. Why do you ask?" I told him everything. About the overheard phone conversations, about the private investigator, about Cassie's behavior since Daniel's death. I showed him the photographs Trevor had given me, the evidence of the affair and the financial conspiracy. When I finished, Mr. Whitman was silent for a long moment. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and shook his head. "Mrs. Chen, if what you're telling me is true, we may be looking at something much bigger than simple will fraud. We may be looking at murder." "What do we do?" "First, we protect you. If Cassie believes she's going to inherit everything and finds out at the will reading that she's not, her reaction could be extreme. Especially if she's already committed murder to get this money." "You think I'm in danger?" "I think you could be. Do you have somewhere safe you could stay? Family? Friends?" I shook my head. "My other children live across the country. And I can't just disappear. Cassie would know something was wrong. Then we need to be very careful about how we handle this. I'm going to call the police and share what you've told me. In the meantime, you need to act normal. Don't let Cassie suspect you know anything." Act normal. Live in the same house as a woman who'd killed my son and pretend everything was fine. 5 more days, until the will reading, I had to share meals with a murderer and make small talk with a woman who was planning to throw me out on the street. If you've ever had to pretend everything was normal while your world was falling apart, you know how exhausting it is. Every word has to be measured, every expression controlled, every gesture calculated. One slip, one moment of dropping your guard, and everything could unravel. But I had to do it. For Daniel. For justice. For the truth. As I drove home that afternoon, I caught sight of Cass's car turning into our driveway ahead of me. She'd been out too, running her own mysterious errands. When I walked into the house, she was in the kitchen making lunch, humming a cheerful tune like she didn't have a care in the world. "Perfect timing," she said with a bright smile. "I made your favorite, chicken salad sandwiches." My favorite. She'd never asked what my favorite anything was, never shown the slightest interest in my preferences. But now, 5 days before the will reading, she was making my favorite lunch and smiling at me like we were the best of friends. The mask was slipping, and underneath, I was beginning to see the real Cassie. Cold, calculating, and absolutely ruthless. I ate that sandwich and smiled back at her, playing my part in this deadly game. But inside, I was counting down the days until Tuesday at 2 o'clock, when the truth would finally come out. I just hoped I'd live long enough to see it. The weekend before the will reading was the longest of my life. Every interaction with Cassie felt like walking through a minefield. One wrong step, one careless word, and everything would explode. Saturday morning brought an unexpected visitor. I was in the garden, trying to find some peace among Daniel's roses, when a silver Mercedes pulled into the driveway. A tall, handsome man in an expensive suit got out and walked toward the house. Even from a distance, I could see the confidence in his stride, the way he carried himself like he owned the world. Marcus Webb. It had to be. I stayed crouched behind the rose bushes, watching as Cassie opened the front door. She looked around nervously before pulling him inside, but not before I caught a glimpse of their embrace. It wasn't the hug of casual friends. It was intimate, familiar, hungry. They disappeared into the house, and I heard the front door lock behind them. Then voices, moving toward Daniel's office. The same office where my son had died, where Cassie now conducted her secret business, where she'd locked away whatever evidence she was hiding. I needed to hear what they were saying, but getting close to that office window meant crossing open ground where they might see me. Still, this might be my only chance to gather real evidence of their conspiracy. Moving as quietly as my 72-year-old knees would allow, I crept along the side of the house until I was directly beneath the office window. It was partially open. Cassie had always complained that the house got stuffy, and their voices drifted down clearly. Nervous about Tuesday, Cassie was saying. The lawyer seemed suspicious when I was there last week. You're overthinking this. Marcus's voice was smooth, confident. Everything is in place. The old woman doesn't suspect anything, the fake will is perfect, and even if anyone questions it, we'll be long gone. Fake will. My blood went cold. They had created a fake will, one that would leave everything to Cassie instead of me. That's why she was so confident about inheriting, why she seemed to know exactly what would happen at the reading. But what if? Cassie, listen to me. We've planned this for 2 years. Every detail has been covered. Daniel's death looked completely natural, the life insurance paid out without question, and in 3 days you'll officially own everything. Then we disappear to somewhere without extradition treaties and live like royalty for the rest of our lives. And Ruth? What about her? She's been asking questions. Little things, but still. What if she becomes a problem? There was a long pause. When Marcus spoke again, his voice was colder, more menacing. Then we handle her the same way we handled Daniel. My heart stopped. They were talking about killing me. As casually as discussing the weather, they were planning my murder. I don't know if I can do that again, Cassie whispered. Daniel was different. He was threatening to expose us. But Ruth, she's just a harmless old woman. Harmless old women can still testify in court. They can still identify conspirators. They can still destroy everything we've worked for. His voice grew harder. If she becomes a liability, she goes. End of discussion. I pressed myself against the side of the house, my whole body shaking. They had killed Daniel. My son, my baby, had been murdered by the woman he trusted most in the world. And now they were planning to kill me too if I got in their way. The potassium chloride worked perfectly with Daniel, Marcus continued. Mimics a heart attack, breaks down quickly in the body, nearly impossible to detect unless you know exactly what to look for. And who's going to order an autopsy on a 72-year-old woman? Especially one who's been so devastated by her son's death. Potassium chloride. That's how they'd killed him. A chemical injection that would cause cardiac arrest and then disappear from his system. Daniel hadn't died of natural causes, he'd been murdered, and the people who claimed to love him most had stood by his grave and accepted condolences while knowing exactly what they'd done. We need to get going, Cassie said. She'll be back from the garden soon. I heard footsteps moving toward the front of the house and quickly scrambled back to my position among the roses. A few minutes later, Marcus emerged and got into his car without looking around. Cassie stood in the doorway, watching him drive away, and for just a moment her mask slipped completely. The expression on her face was cold, calculating, completely devoid of the warmth she'd been showing me for months. When she went back inside, I stayed in the garden for another hour, trying to process what I'd heard. They had a fake will. They were planning to disappear after the reading. And if I caused any problems, they would kill me just like they'd killed Daniel. But now I had something they didn't know I had, the truth. And more importantly, I had evidence of their plan. The real question was what to do with it. I thought about calling the police immediately, but what proof did I have? My word against theirs about a conversation I'd overheard while hiding in bushes. The photos Trevor had shown me proved adultery, but not murder. Without concrete evidence of the fake will or the potassium chloride, it would be my accusations against the grieving widow's denials. No, I needed to be smarter. I needed to let them hang themselves. That evening, Cassie was almost giddy with excitement, though she tried to hide it behind concern for my well-being. You seem tired lately, Ruth. Are you feeling okay? Just missing Daniel more than usual, I replied, watching her face carefully. I know, honey. I miss him too. She reached over and patted my hand, and it took every ounce of self-control not to recoil from her touch. You know, I've been thinking, after Tuesday, after we get through this whole business, maybe you should consider moving closer to your other children. This house has so many painful memories. She was already starting to push me out, laying the groundwork for my departure. Or my disappearance. Maybe you're right, I said carefully. This place does feel different without Daniel. Exactly. And change can be healthy, especially at our age. She smiled that false smile. I might make some changes myself. Travel. Maybe. See the world while I'm still young enough to enjoy it. Travel. To countries without extradition treaties, just like Marcus had said. Sunday was even worse. Cassie was clearly agitated, making and receiving phone calls throughout the day, her voice tense and urgent even when I couldn't make out the words. She kept checking and rechecking her purse, her phone, the locks on the doors. Whatever she was carrying in that purse, it was important enough to make her paranoid about losing it. That afternoon, while she was in the shower, I made a decision that could have gotten me killed. I crept into her bedroom and carefully searched through her purse. What I found confirmed my worst fears. Tucked in a side pocket was a small glass vial, half empty, labeled with scientific markings I couldn't read. But I didn't need to be a chemist to know what it was. The potassium chloride Marcus had mentioned, the weapon they'd used to kill Daniel and were saving to use on me if necessary. Next to the vial was a folded document that made my blood run cold. It was a will, Daniel's will, but not the one Mr. Whitman had shown me. This version left everything to Cassie, with only a small memorial bequest to me. The signatures looked perfect, the legal language was identical, even the paper appeared to be the same. If I hadn't seen the real will, I would never have known this was fake. But the most chilling discovery was a small notebook, filled with Cassie's handwriting. Plans, timelines, contingencies, a complete blueprint for murder and fraud. The entry for the day Daniel died was especially horrifying. D. Suspicious about financial records. Confrontation inevitable. M says tonight, inject while he's working late, make it look like stress-induced cardiac arrest. Insurance investigator won't look too closely at sudden death of overworked businessman. She had written down her plan to murder my son like she was planning a dinner party. I photographed everything with my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. Then I carefully put everything back exactly as I'd found it and retreated to my room. That night, I called Trevor Hawkins. I need to see you, I whispered into the phone. Tomorrow morning, before the will reading. I have evidence. What kind of evidence? The kind that proves they killed Daniel. And the kind that proves they're planning to kill me too. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Where can we meet? The parking lot behind Murphy's Diner. 10 a.m. I'll be there. And Ruth? Be very, very careful until then. After I hung up, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to every sound in the house. Around midnight, I heard Cass's door open and her footsteps in the hallway. They paused outside my room, and I held my breath, praying she couldn't hear my pounding heartbeat. After what felt like hours, she moved away, but I knew she'd been listening, checking to make sure I was asleep. Or maybe debating whether tonight was the night to eliminate a potential problem. I didn't sleep at all. Every shadow looked like a threat, every creak of the house sounded like footsteps. By morning, I was exhausted but wired with adrenaline and the knowledge that in just a few hours, this nightmare would finally begin to end. Monday morning, Cassie was back to her cheerful act, making pancakes and chattering about how she hoped the will reading wouldn't be too emotional. "These legal proceedings can be so overwhelming," she said, flipping a pancake with practiced ease. "I just want to get through it and start the healing process." Healing process. She was talking about healing while carrying poison in her purse and fake documents in her bedroom. "I think I'll go for a drive this morning," I announced. "Clear my head before this afternoon." "That sounds like a wonderful idea. Take your time, I have some errands to run anyway." Errands. Probably meeting with Marcus to finalize their plans for after the will reading. At 10 a.m. sharp, I pulled into the parking lot behind Murphy's Diner. Trevor was already there, leaning against his car with a coffee cup in his hand. When he saw the photos on my phone, his expression grew grim. "This is it," he said quietly. "This is everything we need. The fake will, the poison, the notebook with the murder plan, it's all here. What do we do now?" "We call the police and the district attorney's office. This evidence, combined with what the lawyer already knows about the real will, should be enough to arrest both Cassie and Marcus." Before the will reading. Before the will reading. For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of hope. Justice for Daniel was finally within reach. But Trevor's next words reminded me that we weren't safe yet. "Ruth, you can't go back to that house. If Cassie suspects anything, if she realizes her purse has been searched, she'll use that poison on me. She'll use that poison on you." We called the police from the diner, and within an hour, Detective Martinez, the same man who'd called to tell me about Daniel's death, was sitting across from us in a booth, reviewing the evidence. "Mrs. Chen," he said finally, "I owe you an apology. We should have looked more closely at the circumstances of your son's death. You couldn't have known. We should have known. A healthy 43-year-old man dropping dead with no warning signs? We should have ordered an autopsy." He closed the folder containing the photos. "We're going to arrest them this afternoon, right after the will reading. Let them show up, let them present their fake will, and then we'll have them dead to rights for fraud and conspiracy to commit murder." And Daniel's murder. "The notebook entries are pretty damning, but we'll need to exhume his body for toxicology testing. Potassium chloride breaks down quickly, but there might still be traces we can find." Exhume Daniel's body. The thought of disturbing his rest was heartbreaking, but if it meant proving what Cassie had done to him, it was necessary. "There's one more thing," Detective Martinez said. "We want you to wear a wire to the will reading." "A wire? Like something out of a crime movie. Is that safe?" "We'll have officers positioned all around the building. The moment things go south, we'll move in. But if we can get Cassie or Marcus to say something incriminating on tape, it will make the case airtight." I thought about Daniel, about his trust in people, about his belief that everyone deserved the benefit of the doubt. He would want justice, not just revenge. And if wearing a wire meant ensuring that his killers couldn't hurt anyone else, then that's what I had to do. "Okay," I said. "I'll do it." The next few hours were a blur of preparation. A technician fitted me with a tiny recording device, so small it was virtually invisible beneath my blouse. Detective Martinez coached me on what to say, how to get Cassie and Marcus talking about their plans. "Don't be too obvious," he warned. "These people are smart and dangerous. If they suspect you're recording them." He didn't need to finish the sentence. I knew exactly what would happen if they realized I was working with the police. At 1:30 p.m., I drove to the law offices of Whitman and Associates for what I hoped would be the final confrontation. The building looked the same as it had just a few days earlier, but everything had changed. Today, justice would finally be served. Cassie was already in the lobby when I arrived, looking elegant in a black designer dress, her hair and makeup perfect. She rushed over to me with her arms outstretched. "Oh Ruth, I'm so glad you're here. I was worried you might be too emotional to handle this." As she hugged me, I wondered if she could feel the wire beneath my clothes, if she could hear the pounding of my heart, if she could sense that everything she'd planned was about to unravel. "I wouldn't miss it," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Daniel would want us both to be here. He would. He'd want us to support each other through this difficult time." Support each other. The woman who'd murdered my son was talking about supporting me. We took the elevator to the 10th floor in silence, both lost in our own thoughts. Cassie seemed calm, confident, probably thinking about all the money she was about to inherit. She had no idea that in less than an hour, her world would come crashing down. The receptionist led us to Mr. Whitman's conference room, where Marcus Webb was already waiting. He stood when we entered, extending his hand to me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Chen, I'm Marcus Webb. I was a business associate of Daniel's. Please accept my condolences." Business associate. Such a clean, professional way to describe a relationship built on adultery and murder. "Thank you," I replied, shaking his hand and trying not to think about what those hands had done to my son. Mr. Whitman entered with a thick file folder and took his seat at the head of the conference table. "Thank you all for coming. I know this is a difficult day, but we'll try to keep the proceedings as brief as possible." He opened the folder and pulled out several documents. "Before we begin, I should mention that there have been some irregularities regarding Daniel's estate that we need to address." Cass's smile faltered slightly. "What kind of irregularities?" "It appears that there may be two versions of Daniel's will in circulation. We'll need to determine which one is authentic before we can proceed with the reading." Marcus leaned forward, his confident demeanor slipping just a bit. "Two versions? How is that possible?" This was it. The moment when their carefully constructed plan would start to fall apart. I reached under the table and pressed the record button on my wire, praying that what happened next would give the police everything they needed to lock these monsters away forever. The silence in that conference room was deafening. You could literally hear the air conditioning humming in the background as Mr. Whitman's words sank in. Two versions of the will. Cass's face went through a series of micro-expressions, confusion, then calculation, then barely controlled panic. "I don't understand," she said, her voice pitched higher than usual. "Daniel only had one will. The one he made 2 years ago when we were planning for the future." 2 years ago. Right around the time her affair with Marcus had started, according to Trevor's investigation. The timing wasn't a coincidence. "That's what makes this so unusual," Mr. Whitman continued, spreading several documents across the mahogany table. "This morning, we received what appears to be an updated version of Daniel's will, dated just 3 weeks before his death. But when we compare it to the version in our files..." He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and I caught him shooting a warning glance at Cassie. She was gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles had turned white, the same purse that contained the poison and the fake will. "Perhaps we should examine both documents carefully," Marcus suggested, his voice strained with the effort of staying calm. "There might be a simple explanation." "Oh, there's definitely an explanation," said a new voice from the doorway. Detective Martinez stepped into the room, followed by 2 uniformed officers. The look of shock on Cass's face was almost comical, if the situation hadn't been so deadly serious. "What is this?" she demanded, standing up so quickly her chair rolled backward. "What are the police doing here?" "Mrs. Chen, Mr. Webb, you're both under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and the murder of Daniel Chen." The words hit the room like a bomb. Marcus jumped to his feet, his hand moving toward his jacket pocket, but the uniformed officers were faster. Within seconds, both he and Cassie were in handcuffs. "This is insane." Cassie shrieked, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "Ruth, tell them this is crazy. Tell them we're family." Family. Even now, even caught red-handed, she was still trying to manipulate me. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking with adrenaline and relief. "The only family I had was Daniel," I said quietly. "And you killed him." Her face went white. You can't possibly think." "I know, Cassie. I know about Marcus, about the insurance money, about your plan to disappear. I know about the potassium chloride in your purse and the fake will you created. I know everything." Detective Martinez was reading them their rights, but Cassie wasn't listening. She was staring at me with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You stupid old woman," she hissed. "You have no idea what you've done. Without me, You would have had nothing. Nothing. I would have had my son. That shut her up. For the first time since I'd known her, Cassie had absolutely nothing to say. As they led her away, she turned back one last time. This isn't over, Ruth. You think you've won, but you don't know everything. There are things about Daniel you never suspected. Things that would destroy your precious memories of him. Even in defeat, she was trying to hurt me. Trying to plant seeds of doubt about Daniel's character. But I knew my son, and no lies from his killer would ever change that. After they were gone, Mr. Whitman poured me a glass of water with shaking hands. Mrs. Chen, I must apologize. In 30 years of practice, I've never encountered anything like this. You couldn't have known. We should have been more careful. Should have verified the authenticity of any will changes more thoroughly. He pulled out the genuine will, Daniel's real final wishes. For what it's worth, your son's actual will is quite clear. He left everything to you, his house, his investments, his business interests, even a life insurance policy I wasn't aware of. Life insurance policy, plural. There's more than one. Apparently he took out an additional policy last year through his business. $5 million, with you as the sole beneficiary. He looked up from the documents. Mrs. Chen, you're a very wealthy woman. $5 million. Plus the $2 million Cassie had already collected. Plus the house, the business, the investments. Daniel had made sure I would never want for anything, even as his wife was planning to murder him for money that was never going to be hers anyway. The irony was staggering. If Cassie had just been patient, if she had just been the loving wife Daniel thought she was, she would have inherited everything eventually. Instead, her greed and impatience had cost her everything, and cost Daniel his life. But the money wasn't what mattered to me in that moment. What mattered was that justice was finally being served. Over the next few hours, the full scope of Cassie and Marcus's conspiracy became clear. The police search of her purse had yielded not only the vial of potassium chloride and the fake will, but also a detailed plan for my own murder, should I become problematic. According to the notebook they found in her bedroom, they had been planning Daniel's death for over a year. Marcus, it turned out, was much more than just Cass's lover. He was a con artist with a history of targeting wealthy widows and divorcees. Cassie had been his inside information, providing details about Daniel's finances and business dealings. The plan had been elegant in its simplicity. Kill Daniel with an undetectable poison, collect the insurance money and inheritance, then disappear to a non-extradition country with new identities Marcus had already arranged. The only flaw in their plan was that they had underestimated the importance of making sure the will was genuine. Detective Martinez filled me in on the details during a long debriefing session that evening. Your son suspected something was wrong, he explained. That's why he hired the private investigator, why he was asking questions about his financial accounts. He may not have known about the murder plot, but he knew Cassie was up to something. The night before he died, he called Trevor Hawkins and said he'd found evidence. We think he discovered the fake will. Or maybe financial records that showed money being moved around. Whatever it was, it spooked Cassie and Marcus enough to accelerate their timeline. So Daniel had been close to exposing them. If he'd had just one more day, one more conversation with Trevor, he might have uncovered the whole conspiracy and saved his own life. The guilt was overwhelming. If I had paid more attention, if I had asked more questions, if I had been less trusting of Cass's grief performance, maybe I could have saved him. Maybe I could have seen through her act and realized what was really happening. But Trevor, when I shared these thoughts with him later, was adamant that I not blame myself. Ruth, these people are professionals. They've done this before, and they'll do it again if we don't stop them. Cassie had years to perfect her performance, and Daniel trusted her completely. There's no way you could have known. The arraignment was scheduled for the following week, but neither Cassie nor Marcus would be getting bail. The evidence against them was overwhelming: the fake will, the poison, the detailed murder plans, the financial records showing money being moved to offshore accounts. The district attorney was confident of getting first-degree murder convictions for both of them. I thought I would feel satisfied, vindicated, at peace knowing that Daniel's killers would face justice. Instead, I felt empty, hollow. The money Daniel had left me couldn't buy back his life. The convictions couldn't give me back my son. Justice was important, necessary even, but it wasn't the same as healing. That first night alone in Daniel's house, my house now, was the hardest. Every room held memories of him, but also memories of the months I'd spent living there with his killer. The kitchen where Cassie had made me breakfast while plotting my death. The living room where she'd pretended to grieve while planning her escape. The guest room where I'd lain awake night after night, sensing something was wrong but not knowing how to name it. I found myself in Daniel's office, sitting in the chair where he'd died, looking at the desk where he'd been working when Cassie injected him with poison. Had he felt it happening? Had he realized, in those final moments, what she had done? The thought was unbearable. But then I noticed something I'd missed before, a small framed photograph on his bookshelf that had been turned face down. When I picked it up, I saw it was a picture of Daniel and me from last Christmas, both of us laughing at some joke I couldn't remember. On the back, in Daniel's handwriting, were the words, "My mom, my hero, my inspiration, my best friend. Love always, D." He'd written that just months before his death, when Cassie was already planning to kill him. Even then, even while his wife was betraying him in the worst possible way, he was thinking about how much I meant to him. That's when I finally cried. Not the tears of shock and grief I'd shed when I first learned of his death, but tears of love and loss and gratitude for having had such a wonderful son, even if it was for far too short a time. The next morning brought another surprise. Trevor Hawkins called to tell me that the FBI was now involved in the case. Apparently, Marcus Webb was wanted in connection with similar schemes in 3 other states. They believed he and Cassie, or whatever her real name was, had killed at least 2 other people. Your courage in exposing them may have saved other lives, Trevor told me. There was a widow in Arizona they'd been targeting. If this case had gone differently, she might have been their next victim. It was small comfort, but it was something. Daniel's death, as senseless and tragic as it was, had at least prevented other families from experiencing the same loss. The media attention was intense but brief. Local woman exposes deadly love triangle, the headlines read. Daughter-in-law's murder plot revealed. For a few days, I couldn't leave the house without reporters following me, asking how I'd known, what had tipped me off, how it felt to discover my son had been murdered by someone he trusted. I didn't give interviews. This wasn't about fame or recognition, it was about justice for Daniel. The circus atmosphere around the case felt disrespectful to his memory and to the other victims Marcus and Cassie had likely claimed over the years. But as the weeks passed and the initial media frenzy died down, I started to think about what came next. I had more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. I had a beautiful house filled with memories of my son. I had the satisfaction of knowing his killers would spend the rest of their lives in prison. But I also had a choice to make about how to spend whatever time I had left. I could retreat into grief and isolation, living surrounded by memories and regrets. Or I could find a way to honor Daniel's memory by doing something meaningful with the resources he'd left me. The answer came to me during a conversation with Mr. Whitman about establishing a trust fund. "What would Daniel want you to do with this money?" he asked. Daniel had always believed in helping people, in giving others the chances he'd been given. He'd volunteered at literacy programs, donated to scholarship funds, always looked for ways to lift others up. He would want his legacy to be about hope, not revenge. "I want to start a foundation," I told Mr. Whitman. "Something that helps families who've lost loved ones to violent crimes. Legal assistance, counseling, financial support, whatever they need to get justice and rebuild their lives. That's a beautiful way to honor his memory. And I want to fund training for law enforcement to better recognize the signs of domestic violence and financial abuse. If Daniel's death can help save even one other person. It wouldn't bring Daniel back, but it might prevent other families from going through what we'd experienced. It might help other people recognize the warning signs I'd missed, ask the questions I'd failed to ask, trust their instincts when something felt wrong." As I sat in that lawyer's office, planning Daniel's foundation, I realized something important. Cassie had been wrong about me. I wasn't just a harmless old woman who could be manipulated and discarded. I was a mother who had lost her child, and there is nothing more dangerous in this world than a mother seeking justice for her child. She'd underestimated me, and that mistake had cost her everything. But this story wasn't over yet. The trial was still to come, and I had a feeling Cassie wasn't done trying to hurt me. Her parting words at the law office, about things I didn't know about Daniel, suggested she still had cards to play. I was ready for whatever came next. After everything I'd been through, after everything I'd survived, I wasn't afraid of Cassie or her lies anymore. Bring it on, I thought. I've got nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The real confrontation was still ahead. 6 months later, I sat in the front row of a packed courtroom, watching as the woman who had murdered my son was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit and shackles. Cassie looked different, thinner, paler, her blonde hair now showing dark roots. Prison had stripped away the polished veneer she'd maintained during our months living together. But her eyes were the same. Cold, calculating, filled with a hatred that seemed to burn right through me. The trial had been postponed twice while the prosecution built their case and the defense scrambled to find some way to explain away the overwhelming evidence. Marcus had eventually pled guilty to second-degree murder and conspiracy charges in exchange for testifying against Cassie. His lawyer had painted him as a victim of her manipulation, a weak man led astray by a femme fatale who had orchestrated everything. I knew better. The FBI investigation had revealed that Marcus had been running similar cons for years, targeting vulnerable women and convincing them to kill their husbands for insurance money. Cassie wasn't his first victim. She was his latest partner. The prosecutor, a sharp young woman named Sarah Chen, no relation, despite the name, had walked the jury through the evidence methodically. The fake will, the vial of potassium chloride, the detailed murder plans found in Cassie's notebook. Phone records showing hundreds of calls between Cassie and Marcus in the months before Daniel's death. Financial records proving they had been siphoning money from Daniel's accounts and setting up offshore accounts in preparation for their escape. But the most damaging evidence was the recording from My Wire. The jury had listened in horrified silence as they heard Cassie and Marcus discussing Daniel's murder with the casual indifference of people planning a vacation. The potassium chloride worked perfectly with Daniel. Marcus's voice had filled the courtroom. Mimics a heart attack, breaks down quickly in the body. Several jurors had looked physically sick as the recording played. One elderly woman in the front row had tears streaming down her face. These were ordinary people, parents, grandparents, spouses, and the cold-blooded nature of the conspiracy had clearly shaken them. Cassie's defense attorney, an expensive suit named Richard Blackstone, had done his best to create reasonable doubt. He'd suggested that I had fabricated evidence out of grief and a desire for revenge. He'd claimed the recording was taken out of context, that Marcus and Cassie had been discussing a television show or a book, not an actual murder. But he couldn't explain away the physical evidence. The vial of poison found in Cassie's purse. The fake will with forged signatures. The notebook detailing the murder plot in Cassie's own handwriting. On the 4th day of trial, Cassie herself took the stand. It was a desperate move by her defense team, but they probably felt they had no choice. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and their only hope was to somehow make her seem sympathetic, to convince the jury that she was a victim rather than a perpetrator. She was a compelling witness, I'll give her that. Dressed in a conservative navy suit, her hair pulled back in a simple bun, she looked like a grieving widow rather than a cold-blooded killer. When she spoke about Daniel, her voice broke with what seemed like genuine emotion. I loved my husband, she told the jury, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. He was everything to me. The idea that I could have hurt him, that I could have planned his death, it's incomprehensible. She spun an elaborate story about being coerced by Marcus, about being threatened and manipulated into helping him. According to her testimony, Marcus had discovered her affair with him, she admitted to that much, and used it to blackmail her into helping with his financial schemes. He said if I didn't cooperate, he would tell Daniel about the affair and destroy my marriage, she testified. I was weak, I was scared, and I made terrible decisions. But I never wanted Daniel to die. I never planned his murder. It was a good performance. If I hadn't known the truth, if I hadn't heard her discussing Daniel's death with such casual indifference, I might have believed her myself. But then came the cross-examination. Prosecutor Chen was merciless. She walked Cassie through every detail of the conspiracy, every lie she had told, every piece of evidence that contradicted her testimony. She played portions of the wire recording, forcing Cassie to explain how discussing the perfect effects of potassium chloride could be taken out of context. You testified that you loved your husband, Chen said, pacing in front of the witness stand. But you were having an affair with Marcus Webb for 2 years before Daniel's death, correct? Yes, but... And you were moving money from your husband's accounts into accounts controlled by Mr. Webb, correct? Marcus made me. And you had a vial of potassium chloride, a deadly poison, in your purse on the day of the will reading, correct? I can explain. Can you explain why, if you were being coerced by Mr. Webb, you wrote detailed murder plans in your own handwriting? Chen held up the notebook, and Cass's face went white. This was the evidence that destroyed any credibility her testimony might have had. No one had forced her to write those plans. No one had coerced her into detailing exactly how and when to kill Daniel. Those were her own words, her own thoughts, her own murderous intentions spelled out in black ink. "Those aren't what they look like," Cassie stammered, but even she seemed to know how weak it sounded. "Really? Then please explain to the jury what this entry means." Chen read from the notebook, "D asking too many questions about money. M says we need to move fast. Injection tonight while he's working, make it look like cardiac arrest from stress." The courtroom was dead silent. Even Cass's own lawyer looked defeated. I was just writing down things Marcus told me to write. He said it would help him remember. Help him remember how to murder your husband. No, it wasn't like that. But it was too late. The jury could see through her lies as clearly as I had seen through her grief performance. She was trapped by her own words, her own handwriting, her own carefully documented plan to kill the man who had loved and trusted her. That evening, as I sat in my hotel room waiting for the jury to return with their verdict, I reflected on everything that had led to this moment. It had been almost a year since Daniel's death, almost a year since that phone call at 3:17 a.m. that had changed everything. In that time, I had learned things about myself I never knew. I had discovered reserves of strength and courage I didn't know I possessed. I had learned to trust my instincts, to question what seemed too convenient, to fight for the truth even when everyone else accepted comfortable lies. But I had also learned about the depths of human greed and cruelty. I had seen how someone could share a bed with a person they planned to murder, could accept sympathy and support from the mother of their victim, could pretend to grieve while counting insurance money. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict with a clear, strong voice. "On the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted. Cassie collapsed in her chair, her lawyer putting an arm around her shoulders as she sobbed. Real tears this time, tears of fear and desperation rather than the crocodile tears she'd perfected over the years. But as the bailiff moved to escort her back to holding, she turned and looked directly at me. The mask was completely gone now, replaced by pure, undiluted hatred. "You think you've won," she mouthed silently, her lips barely moving. "But you don't know everything about precious Daniel." Even now, even facing life in prison, she was still trying to hurt me. Still trying to plant seeds of doubt about my son's character. It was pathetic, really, but also chilling. This was a woman who would never stop fighting, never stop trying to inflict pain on anyone who had crossed her. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. Under the state's murder statutes, Cassie faced either life in prison without parole or the death penalty. Given the premeditated nature of the crime and the cold-blooded planning involved, the prosecutor was seeking the ultimate punishment. I wasn't sure how I felt about that. Part of me wanted Cassie to suffer as much as possible, to pay the ultimate price for what she'd done to Daniel. But another part of me, the part that Daniel had always appealed to when he talked about forgiveness and second chances, wondered if death was really justice or just revenge. In the end, it didn't matter what I wanted. The judge sentenced Cassie to life in prison without the possibility of parole, saying that while her crimes were heinous, the state's evidence, while overwhelming, was largely circumstantial when it came to the actual moment of Daniel's death. "The defendant will spend the rest of her natural life behind bars," Judge Henderson announced, his voice grave and final. "She will never again have the opportunity to harm innocent people in pursuit of her own selfish desires." Marcus, who had cooperated with prosecutors, received 25 years to life. He would be eligible for parole when he was 73, if he lived that long. Federal charges were still pending for his involvement in similar schemes in other states. As I left the courthouse that day, surrounded by reporters shouting questions and camera flashes going off in every direction, I thought the nightmare was finally over. Cassie was in prison for the rest of her life. Marcus was facing decades behind bars. Daniel's killers had been brought to justice, and his memory had been vindicated. I was wrong. The worst was yet to come. It started with a letter, delivered to my house 3 days after the sentencing. No return address, postmarked from the women's correctional facility where Cassie was being held. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief message in Cassie's familiar handwriting. "Ruth, you destroyed my life based on lies and assumptions. It's time you learned the truth about your perfect son. Check his computer. Look in the hidden files. You might be surprised by what dear Daniel was really up to. Sweet dreams. See. I should have thrown the letter away. I should have recognized it for what it was, a desperate attempt by a convicted murderer to cause me pain from behind bars. But doubt is a powerful thing, and Cassie knew exactly where to plant it. Daniel's computer was still in his home office, untouched since the police investigation. They had examined it thoroughly, looking for any evidence that might support or contradict Cassie's story, but had found nothing relevant to the murder case. But they hadn't been looking for whatever Cassie was referring to now. I sat in front of that computer for an hour before I finally turned it on, my finger hovering over the power button as I debated whether I really wanted to know what, if anything, Cassie was talking about. Daniel's desktop looked exactly as he'd left it. Work folders, family photos, bookmarks to his favorite news sites and sports pages. Everything normal, everything exactly what you'd expect from a loving son and successful businessman. But then I remembered something Trevor had taught me during our investigation. People often hid things in places they thought no one would look. I started searching through hidden folders, temporary files, anything that might contain information Daniel hadn't wanted to be easily accessible. That's when I found it. Buried deep in a folder marked Taxes 2019 was a subfolder with an innocuous name, MISC Receipts. But inside that folder were files that made my blood run cold. Financial records showing large cash withdrawals from Daniel's business accounts. Records of payments to something called Mercy Investigations. Email correspondence about ongoing surveillance and target acquisition. My hands were shaking as I opened the emails and began to read. What I found there shattered everything I thought I knew about my son. Daniel hadn't just suspected Cassie of having an affair, he had known about it for over a year. The emails showed he had hired not one but two different private investigation firms to document her adultery. He had photos, recordings, detailed reports of her meetings with Marcus and their financial schemes. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what he planned to do with this information. In an email to his lawyer dated just 1 week before his death, Daniel had written, "I want to file for divorce immediately and pursue criminal charges for embezzlement. I also want to make sure she gets absolutely nothing in the settlement. Not the house, not my business interests, not a penny of alimony. She chose to betray our marriage, and I'm going to make sure she pays for it." Daniel had been planning to destroy Cass's life just as thoroughly as she had been planning to destroy his. He wasn't the innocent, trusting victim I had believed him to be. He was a man seeking his own kind of revenge. But there was more. Much more. Deeper in the files, I found records of payments to a man named Vincent Torres, payments that had nothing to do with private investigation services. According to the email trail, Vincent was what they called a fixer, someone who specialized in making problems disappear. The final email in the chain, sent just 2 days before Daniel's death, made my skin crawl. "Vincent, need to accelerate our timeline. Target is becoming suspicious and may flee before we can implement the permanent solution. Confirmed payment of $500,000 on completion. Make it look accidental. D. Permanent solution. Make it look accidental." Daniel had been planning to have Cassie killed. I sat back in the chair, my mind reeling with the implications of what I'd discovered. My son, my kind, generous, trusting son, had been planning to commit murder. He had been willing to pay $500,000 to have his wife assassinated rather than simply divorce her and move on with his life. The man I thought I knew, the man I had mourned and fought to avenge, had been just as cold and calculating as the woman who killed him. But then I found something else that changed everything once again. Hidden in another subfolder was a medical file. Daniel had been seeing a psychiatrist, Dr. Margaret Rosen, for the past 6 months before his death. The sessions had been recorded, apparently with the doctor's permission for therapeutic purposes, and Daniel had kept copies. In these recordings, I heard a man who was falling apart. A man who had discovered his wife's betrayal and was struggling with feelings of rage, betrayal, and despair that were consuming him from the inside. "I think about killing her every day," his voice said through the computer speakers. "I fantasize about making her suffer the way she's made me suffer. And that scares me, Dr. Rosen. That's not who I am. That's not who I want to be." "These feelings are normal, Daniel," Dr. Rosen's calm voice replied. "You've suffered a profound betrayal. The anger you're experiencing is a natural response to trauma. But it's getting worse. Yesterday I actually looked up ways to hurt her. To make her disappear. I found myself researching people who do that kind of work." His voice broke. "My God, What am I becoming? The recordings revealed a man at war with himself, torn between his desire for revenge and his fundamental decency. In session after session, he struggled with violent thoughts while also expressing horror at his own capacity for darkness. And then, in the final recording, dated just 3 days before his death, I heard something that broke my heart all over again. Dr. Rosen, I can't do this anymore. I can't live with these thoughts, these plans. I'm going to call off everything with Vincent. I'm going to file for divorce and let the courts handle it. Cassie can have whatever she wants, the house, half the business, whatever keeps me from becoming a monster. That sounds like a very healthy decision, Daniel. I called my mother last night, just to hear her voice. She always believed I was a good person, you know? I can't let her down by becoming something evil. I'd rather lose everything than lose her respect. He had called off the hit. Daniel had been planning to murder Cassie, but in the end, his conscience, and his love for me, had stopped him from going through with it. But Cassie and Marcus hadn't known that. They had killed him believing he was still a threat, not knowing that he had already decided to choose the moral path over revenge. The tragedy was complete. Daniel had been murdered for a crime he had chosen not to commit. He had died because he had decided to be the good man I always believed him to be, but his killers had acted on what he had been planning to do, not what he had decided to do. As I sat in that office, surrounded by the evidence of my son's moral struggle, I finally understood why Cassie had been so confident that her letter would destroy me. She had known about Daniel's plans to have her killed, probably through Marcus, who might have had connections to the same underworld figures Daniel had contacted. In her twisted mind, this knowledge made her the victim and Daniel the true villain. She couldn't accept that Daniel had ultimately chosen not to go through with his revenge plans, just as she couldn't accept responsibility for driving him to such desperate measures in the first place. The truth was more complex than either of us had realized. Daniel wasn't the perfect son I had believed him to be, but he also wasn't the cold-blooded killer Cassie wanted me to think he was. He was a human being who had been pushed to the edge of his moral boundaries by betrayal and had ultimately pulled back before crossing the line. Cassie, on the other hand, had crossed that line without hesitation. But the knowledge of Daniel's darker thoughts, his capacity for violence, his willingness to at least consider murder as a solution to his problems, it changed how I saw him. It made him more complex, more flawed, more human. And strangely, it made me love him even more. Because in the end, when it mattered most, he had chosen to be the man I raised him to be. He had chosen love over hate, justice over revenge, morality over expedience. He had died because he refused to become a killer, even when his wife was actively trying to kill him. That night, I burned every document I had found, every recording, every piece of evidence of Daniel's struggle with his darker impulses. The world didn't need to know about his momentary moral crisis. What mattered was the choice he had made in the end. I wrote one final letter to Cassie, which I never sent but kept in my journal. Cassie, you were right that I didn't know everything about Daniel. But you were wrong about what it would do to me. Learning that my son struggled with dark thoughts only makes me prouder of the man he chose to be. You killed him because you were afraid of what he might do to you. But you never gave him the chance to prove he was better than that. You never gave him the chance to show mercy. In the end, you were the monster, not him. I hope you spend the rest of your life in that cell thinking about that. Cass's final attempt to hurt me had backfired. Instead of destroying my memories of Daniel, it had given me a deeper understanding of who he really was, not a perfect man, but a good man who had faced his worst impulses and overcome them. That was a legacy worth honoring. The Daniel Chen Foundation for Justice opened its doors exactly 1 year after my son's murder. The ceremony was small, just myself, the staff I'd hired, a few local officials, and Trevor Hawkins, who had become more than just a private investigator in my life. He'd become a friend, one of the few people who truly understood what I'd been through. Standing in the lobby of our new offices, looking at the plaque bearing Daniel's name and photo, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but a sense that I was finally moving forward rather than just surviving. The foundation offered 3 main services: legal assistance for families of murder victims, financial support during the lengthy trial process, and education programs to help people recognize the warning signs of domestic violence and financial abuse. In just 6 months, we had helped 43 families and prevented at least 2 cases that might have ended in tragedy. But if I'm being completely honest with you, and that's what this story is about, complete honesty, the foundation wasn't just about helping others. It was about helping me. Every family we assisted, every person we saved from a dangerous situation, felt like a small victory for Daniel. It felt like his death had meaning beyond the waste and senselessness of murder. The letter came on a Tuesday morning in March, nearly 18 months after Daniel's death. I recognized the handwriting immediately, though it looked shakier than before, more uncertain. Mrs. Chen, it began. I know you have no reason to read this, and even less reason to believe anything I say. But I need to tell you something that might matter to you. I should have thrown it away. After everything Cassie had put me through, after her attempts to poison my memories of Daniel even from prison, I owed her nothing. Not my time, not my attention, certainly not my forgiveness. But something about the tone of this letter was different. Less angry, less vindictive. More defeated. I've been in here for over a year now, the letter continued, and I've had a lot of time to think about what I did. Not just to Daniel, but to you. To his memory. To the truth. The truth. That was rich, coming from someone whose entire relationship with my son had been built on lies. I want you to know that I've read about your foundation. I've seen the news stories about the families you've helped, the lives you've saved. It's what Daniel would have wanted. He always believed in helping people, in making things better. I forgot that about him, or maybe I never really understood it. I put the letter down and walked to the kitchen, pouring myself a cup of coffee with hands that were steadier than I expected. Whatever game Cassie was playing now, whatever manipulation she was attempting from behind bars, I wasn't going to let it affect me. But when I came back and continued reading, her words hit me like a physical blow. There's something I never told anyone, not even Marcus. Something that happened the night before Daniel died that changes everything. My coffee cup rattled against the saucer as I set it down. Daniel came home that night around 11 o'clock. I thought he was asleep, but he found me in his office, looking through his files. I had been searching for evidence of his financial accounts, anything Marcus could use to access his money after we went through with our plan. She had been in Daniel's office the night before his death, going through his private papers, looking for ways to steal from him even as she prepared to kill him. When he caught me, I expected him to be angry, to demand explanations. Instead, he just stood there in the doorway for the longest time, looking at me like he was seeing me for the first time. I could picture it perfectly. Daniel's face when he finally understood the depth of Cass's betrayal. Not just the affair, not just the financial schemes, but the complete violation of trust that came with searching through his private papers in the dead of night. Then he said something I'll never forget. Cassie, I know about Marcus. I know about the money. I know about all of it. And I forgive you. Forgive you. Even knowing what she was planning, even catching her red-handed going through his private files, Daniel had offered forgiveness. I thought it was a trick, the letter continued. Some kind of setup. So I denied everything, made up lies about why I was in his office. But he just shook his head and said, I'm not going to fight you anymore. If you want out of this marriage, we can work something out. If you want to be with Marcus, I won't stand in your way. But please, don't destroy yourself by doing something you can't take back. Daniel had known. He had known about the affair, about the money, probably even about the murder plot. And instead of threatening or attacking or calling the police, he had offered her a way out. He told me he'd been seeing a therapist, that he'd been struggling with anger and thoughts of revenge, but that he'd decided those feelings were destroying him. He said he didn't want to become the kind of person who hurt others, even people who had hurt him. This matched everything I'd found in Daniel's computer files. In his final days, he had chosen compassion over vengeance, forgiveness over retaliation. Mrs. Chen, your son offered me a chance to walk away. To end the marriage quietly, take a fair settlement, and start over somewhere else with Marcus. No police, no public humiliation, no criminal charges. Just a quiet divorce and a fresh start. The ultimate irony. Daniel had been willing to let Cassie go, to give her exactly what she wanted, if only she would choose the peaceful path over violence. I should have taken that offer. I should have seen it for the gift it was, a chance to end things without anyone getting hurt. But I was already too far down the path we'd chosen. Marcus had convinced me that Daniel was just trying to trick us, that he would never let us go, that the only way to get what we wanted was to go through with the original plan. So she had killed him anyway. Despite his offer of forgiveness, despite his willingness to let her have what she wanted without a fight, she had chosen murder over mercy. I injected him with the potassium chloride the next evening while he was working at his desk. He looked up at me when he felt the needle, and instead of anger or fear in his eyes, there was just sadness. Like he was disappointed in me. Like he had hoped, even at the end, that I might choose better. I had to stop reading. The image of Daniel's final moments, the knowledge that he had died not in fear but in disappointment, was almost unbearable. He had extended grace to his killer right up until the end, and she had thrown it back in his face. I don't expect you to forgive me, the letter concluded. I don't deserve forgiveness from you or from anyone. But I wanted you to know that Daniel died as he lived, trying to see the best in people, trying to help even those who had wronged him. He was a better person than I ever was or ever could be. And his last words to me, the night before he died, were, I hope you find whatever you're looking for, Cassie. I hope it makes you happy. I hope it makes you happy. Even knowing she was planning to kill him, Daniel had wished happiness for his murderer. The letter was signed simply C, with a postscript that made me wonder if Cassie was finally, truly understanding what she had done. The money, the house, the life we stole, none of it made us happy. Marcus is in solitary confinement after attacking another inmate. I spend my days staring at walls and remembering the look in Daniel's eyes when I chose to kill him instead of accepting his forgiveness. We got everything we thought we wanted, and it destroyed us both. I folded the letter carefully and put it in my desk drawer, next to all the other documents from this long, painful journey. Then I sat back and tried to process what I had just learned. Daniel's final act hadn't been one of naivety or victimhood, it had been one of conscious choice. He had chosen forgiveness over revenge, compassion over justice, hope over hatred. Even in the face of ultimate betrayal, he had tried to offer his betrayers a path to redemption. And they had chosen to kill him instead. The Foundation took on new meaning after reading that letter. We weren't just helping victims of crime. We were trying to honor the memory of a man who had believed in the power of forgiveness even when it cost him his life. But the letter also raised questions I wasn't sure I was ready to answer. If Daniel could forgive Cassie for planning his murder, what did that mean for my own feelings toward her? If my son could offer grace to his killer, was I obligated to do the same? I spent weeks thinking about this, discussing it with Trevor, with my therapist, with the pastor at the church Daniel and I had attended together. The consensus seemed to be that forgiveness was a choice, not an obligation, and that I was under no pressure to extend grace to someone who had caused me so much pain. But I couldn't stop thinking about Daniel's words, I hope it makes you happy. Even in his final conversation with his killer, he had focused not on his own pain but on her well-being. 3 months after receiving Cassie's letter, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I arranged to visit her in prison. The women's correctional facility was a grim place, concrete walls, razor wire, the constant sound of metal doors slamming shut. Cassie looked older than her years, her blonde hair now completely grey, her face lined with what looked like genuine remorse. We sat across from each other at a metal table, separated by a thick pane of glass, speaking through phones that made our voices sound tinny and distant. You came, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I came. Why? I had been asking myself the same question during the entire drive to the prison. Why visit the woman who had destroyed my family? Why give her the satisfaction of seeing me, of knowing that her letter had affected me? Because Daniel would have wanted me to. She started crying then, not the manipulative tears she had perfected during our months living together, but the raw, ugly tears of someone finally confronting the full weight of their actions. Mrs. Chen, I am so sorry. I know that doesn't mean anything, I know it doesn't change what I did, but I need you to know that I am sorry. Are you sorry you killed him, or sorry you got caught? The question hung in the air between us for a long moment. Finally, she looked up at me with eyes that seemed genuinely haunted. Both, she admitted. For a long time, I was just sorry I got caught. Sorry that my plan failed. But being in here, having time to think about what I really did. Mrs. Chen, I killed the best man I ever knew because I was too greedy and too proud to accept his forgiveness. We talked for 2 hours. She told me about her childhood, about the series of bad relationships and poor choices that had led her to Marcus, about the way greed and desperation had gradually consumed her humanity until she became capable of murder. I told her about the Foundation, about the families we were helping, about the way Daniel's memory was being honored through service to others. When visiting time was up, she asked me one final question. Do you think he would forgive me? Really forgive me? I thought about everything I had learned about my son in the months since his death. His struggle with dark thoughts, his ultimate choice of compassion over revenge, his final offer of grace to the woman planning his murder. Yes, I said. I think he would. Do you? That was the harder question. Could I forgive the woman who had murdered my son? Could I extend grace to someone who had caused me such profound pain? I'm working on it, I told her honestly. But Cassie, forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean what you did was okay. And it doesn't mean you shouldn't face the consequences of your actions. I understand. But Daniel believed in redemption. He believed people could change, could become better than they were. If you really are sorry, if you really understand what you did, then maybe there's hope for you yet. As I drove home from the prison that day, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 2 years: closure. Not happiness, not satisfaction, but a sense that this chapter of my life was finally complete. Cassie would spend the rest of her life in prison, and Marcus wasn't far behind her. Justice had been served. But more importantly, Daniel's legacy of forgiveness and redemption was living on through the foundation and through my own willingness to see humanity even in someone who had committed an inhuman act. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, if you've ever had your world turned upside down by someone else's greed or cruelty, you know how hard it is to find peace with that betrayal. But I learned something important through this whole ordeal. Holding on to hatred hurts you more than it hurts the person who wronged you. Daniel chose forgiveness over revenge, even when it cost him his life. I chose to honor that choice, not because Cassie deserved forgiveness, but because Daniel deserved to be remembered for the grace he showed rather than the violence done to him. That doesn't mean the pain goes away. It doesn't mean I don't still miss my son every single day. But it means I can sleep at night knowing that his death wasn't meaningless, that his life continues to make a difference in the world. And sometimes, that's enough. I thought the story ended with that prison visit, with forgiveness and closure and the foundation helping families across 3 states. I was wrong. The most dangerous part was yet to come. It started with small things: hang-up calls to the foundation office, someone following me home from the grocery store, the feeling of being watched when I was working in Daniel's garden. At first, I attributed it to paranoia, to the hypervigilance that comes from having survived an attempt on your life. But then Trevor called me on a Wednesday morning in September, his voice tight with concern. "Ruth, we need to talk. In person. Not over the phone." Within an hour, I was sitting across from him at our old table in Murphy's Diner, watching him spread photographs across the scratched Formica surface. They were surveillance photos, grainy, taken from a distance, but clear enough to make my blood run cold. "Who took these?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. "Someone who's been watching you for at least 2 weeks. They were delivered to my office this morning with a note." He handed me a piece of paper with words cut from magazines, like something out of a bad movie. "The old woman destroyed our family. Time for payback." "Marcus?" I whispered. "Marcus is still in maximum security. But he has friends on the outside. People who owe him favors, people who were part of his operation before Daniel's death." The photographs showed me at the grocery store, at the foundation office, arriving home in the evenings. Someone had been documenting my daily routine with the methodical precision of a predator planning an attack. "There's more," Trevor said grimly. He pulled out another envelope, this one containing financial records. "Someone's been asking questions about the foundation's money. They've contacted 3 different banks, claiming to be conducting an audit on behalf of the IRS. It's not legitimate, but it suggests they're trying to figure out how to get access to Daniel's inheritance." Even after all this time? Even after everything that happened? "Ruth, we're talking about millions of dollars. To people like Marcus and his associates, that's worth waiting for. Worth killing for." The waiter refilled our coffee cups, oblivious to the danger being discussed at table 7. I envied him his ignorance, his simple world where the biggest concern was whether someone wanted cream with their coffee. "What do I do?" I asked. "First, you're not going home tonight. Or tomorrow night. We're going to put you somewhere safe while I figure out exactly who we're dealing with. I can't just disappear. The foundation. The foundation won't help anybody if you're dead." The safe house was a small apartment across town, furnished with the bare necessities and protected by a security system that would have impressed the Pentagon. Trevor had called in favors from his days as a police officer, putting together a protection detail that worked in shifts around the clock. For 3 days, I lived like a prisoner in my own city, watching the news and reading books while armed guards watched the windows. It felt like being back in those terrifying weeks after Daniel's death, when I didn't know who to trust or where the next threat would come from. The breakthrough came when Trevor traced the source of the surveillance photos. They had been taken by a private investigator named Jimmy Valdez, who had a history of working for people who operated on the wrong side of the law. Valdez is small-time, Trevor explained during one of his security briefings. He does divorce cases, insurance fraud, that kind of thing. But he's also been known to work for people who pay in cash and don't ask for receipts. Can you talk to him? Already did. Guy's scared out of his mind. Apparently, his client paid him $5,000 to watch you for 2 weeks and document your routine. But when Valdez asked for a name or contact information, he was told that wasn't necessary. So we still don't know who's behind this. We know it's someone with money. $5,000 plus expenses isn't pocket change. And we know they're planning something that requires detailed knowledge of your movements. That night, alone in the safe house with nothing but my thoughts for company, I made a decision that probably would have horrified Trevor and definitely would have gotten me fired from my own protection detail. I was going to stop running. Daniel hadn't run from Cassie and Marcus, even when he knew they were planning something. He had faced the threat head-on, offering forgiveness and hoping for the best. Yes, it had gotten him killed, but it had also preserved his integrity and his values. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life hiding from shadows and phantom threats. If someone wanted to come after me, they would find me ready. The next morning, against the vehement protests of my security team, I returned to my normal routine. I went to the foundation office, I attended meetings with families who needed our help, I grocery shopped and worked in the garden and lived my life. But I wasn't stupid about it. Trevor had taught me basic security precautions, varying my routes, checking for surveillance, staying in public places whenever possible. I carried a panic button that would summon help within minutes. And I made sure that everyone I cared about knew where I was and what I was doing at all times. The attack came on a Friday evening in October, exactly 3 weeks after the first threatening photos had been delivered. I was leaving the foundation office after a late meeting with potential donors when I noticed the white van parked across the street. It had been there when I arrived 3 hours earlier, which was unusual for that neighborhood. Most people didn't park there unless they had business in one of the surrounding office buildings. Instead of walking directly to my car, I ducked into the coffee shop on the corner and called Trevor. White van, license plate 7G4-9NX, I reported quietly, watching through the window as 2 men got out of the vehicle and started walking toward the foundation building. Stay where you are, Trevor said. I could hear him typing rapidly on his computer. That plate comes back stolen. I'm calling this in and heading your way. But the men weren't heading toward the building anymore. They were walking directly toward the coffee shop, their eyes fixed on the window where I was standing. I moved away from the window, toward the back of the shop, trying to stay calm. The owner, a friendly Korean woman named Mrs. Park, noticed my distress. You okay, honey? You look scared. Could you call 911? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Tell them there's a situation at the Foundation for Justice office building. Mrs. Park didn't ask questions. She picked up the phone behind the counter and started dialing, while I continued moving toward the back exit. The 2 men entered the coffee shop just as I reached the rear door. One was tall and thin with prison tattoos covering his arms. The other was shorter, stockier, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Both looked exactly like the kind of men Marcus Webb would call friends. Ruth Chen. The tall one's voice was polite, almost conversational. We'd like to have a word with you. I don't think so. I pushed through the back door into an alley behind the building, my heart pounding as I heard footsteps following me. The alley was narrow, lined with dumpsters and loading docks, with only one exit onto the main street. If they cornered me here, the police wouldn't arrive in time to help. But I had one advantage they probably hadn't counted on. I was 74 years old, and I had nothing left to lose. When the tall man reached for my arm, I did something Trevor had taught me during our security briefings. I stomped down hard on his instep with the heel of my shoe, then brought my elbow up sharply into his solar plexus. He doubled over with a grunt of pain, and I ran. The shorter man was faster, catching up to me just as I reached the mouth of the alley. He grabbed my purse strap, trying to yank me backward, but I spun around and sprayed him in the face with the pepper spray Trevor had insisted I carry. He screamed and stumbled backward, hands clawing at his eyes, just as police sirens began wailing in the distance. Both men fled, leaving me alone in the alley with my heart hammering against my ribs and the acrid smell of pepper spray burning my nostrils. The police found the abandoned van 3 blocks away, wiped clean of fingerprints but containing a disturbing collection of items: rope, duct tape, a shovel, and a printed map showing the location of several remote areas outside the city limits. "They weren't planning to rob you," Detective Martinez told me as we reviewed the evidence later that evening. "This was a kidnapping attempt, probably leading to murder." "But why now? It's been over 2 years since the trial." "We think someone's been planning this for a while. The surveillance, the financial inquiries about the foundation, this was a long-term operation designed to figure out how to get access to Daniel's inheritance through you. Through me. Think about it, Ruth. You're the sole beneficiary of a multimillion-dollar estate. If something happens to you, that money goes to your other children, who live across the country and have no connection to this case. But if someone could kidnap you, force you to sign over power of attorney or transfer funds." The picture was becoming clear. Someone, probably associates of Marcus Webb, had been planning to torture me into giving them access to Daniel's money. The same money Cassie and Marcus had killed him for, the same money that was now funding a foundation dedicated to helping other families avoid what we had gone through. "Do we know who's behind it?" Detective Martinez pulled out a file folder thick with photographs and documents. "We think we do. Ever hear the name Vincent Torres?" The name hit me like a physical blow. Vincent Torres, the fixer Daniel had contacted when he was planning his own revenge against Cassie. The man he had been planning to pay $500,000 to kill his wife. Oh my God. "You recognize the name?" I told him about the files I'd found on Daniel's computer, about the payments to Vincent Torres, about the plan Daniel had ultimately abandoned in favor of forgiveness and a peaceful divorce. "That explains everything," Martinez said grimly. "Torres was expecting to collect $500,000 from your son for a job he never got to complete. When Daniel was murdered, Torres lost a major payday. He's probably been watching this case from the beginning, waiting for his chance to collect what he thinks is owed. But Daniel never went through with hiring him. He called it off. Torres doesn't know that. All he knows is that he was promised money by a man who's now dead, and the man's mother inherited millions of dollars. In his mind, you owe him what Daniel promised to pay." The next few weeks were a cat-and-mouse game played across the entire city. Torres and his associates, the police had identified at least 3 other men involved in the conspiracy, kept trying to get close to me, and I kept evading them with the help of an expanded security team. They tried everything: fake delivery attempts, phony charity solicitations, even an elaborate scheme involving a staged car accident designed to get me to stop and help. But Trevor had prepared me well, and I recognized each attempt for what it was. The frustrating part was that we couldn't arrest them for planning crimes they hadn't yet committed. The attempted kidnapping in the alley had been dismissed as a robbery gone wrong. Both men had fled before the police could apprehend them, and their faces had been too obscured by shadows and baseball caps for positive identification. "We need to catch them in the act," Detective Martinez explained during one of our strategy sessions. "Or we need Torres to make contact directly, so we can get evidence of the extortion attempt." "What if I reached out to him first?" The room went silent. Trevor, Detective Martinez, and the FBI agent who had joined our team all stared at me like I'd suggested walking into a lion's den wearing a meat suit. "Absolutely not," Trevor said firmly. "Ruth, this man is a professional killer. He's not going to sit down for coffee and discuss payment terms." "But what if he would? What if I offered to pay him what Daniel had promised? Set up a meeting and record the conversation?" "It's too dangerous," the FBI agent said. "Torres has nothing to lose at this point. If he realizes it's a setup, he could decide to cut his losses and eliminate the only witness who can connect him to Daniel's original revenge plot." But the seed of an idea had been planted. Over the next few days, as I continued living under armed guard and watching over my shoulder for threats, I kept thinking about the psychology of men like Vincent Torres. They were businessmen, in their own twisted way. They operated on the principle that debts must be paid and contracts must be honored. What if I could convince Torres that I was willing to honor Daniel's contract? What if I could present myself not as a victim to be kidnapped and tortured, but as a client seeking his services? The plan I developed was insane, dangerous, and probably illegal. It was also the only way I could see to end this nightmare once and for all. Without telling anyone on my security team, I used an encrypted messaging service to contact Vincent Torres directly. The message was simple. Mr. Torres, I believe my son Daniel Chen hired you for a service that was never completed due to his untimely death. I would like to discuss completing this transaction. I am prepared to pay the agreed-upon amount plus interest for your discretion and professionalism. Please contact me to arrange a meeting. The response came within 6 hours. Warehouse District, Pier 47, tomorrow at midnight. Come alone, bring cash. I spent the day making arrangements that would either end this threat forever or get me killed in the process. I wrote letters to my surviving children, explaining what I was doing and why. I updated my will, leaving the majority of Daniel's inheritance to the foundation. I recorded a video message for Trevor, thanking him for everything he had done and apologizing for the deception I was about to commit. Then I did something that would have shocked everyone who knew me. I bought a gun. I'd never owned a firearm in my life, never even held one except for the brief training session Trevor had insisted on after the coffee shop incident. But if I was going to face Vincent Torres alone, I wanted more than just pepper spray and a panic button. The gun store owner, a gruff man in his 60s who reminded me of my late husband, took one look at me and shook his head. Lady, I don't know what kind of trouble you're in, but buying a gun the day before you plan to use it isn't a smart move. You need training, practice, familiarity with the weapon. I don't have time for training. Then you don't have business carrying a gun. But he sold it to me anyway, along with a box of ammunition and a quick lesson in basic operation. Point, squeeze the trigger, don't jerk it, he instructed. And pray you never have to use it. That evening, I disabled the tracking device Trevor had insisted I carry and drove to the Warehouse District alone. Pier 47 was a desolate stretch of waterfront lined with abandoned buildings and rusting shipping containers. The perfect place for someone to disappear forever. Vincent Torres was waiting for me in the shadow of a corrugated metal building, just as he'd promised. He was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 5'6", slight build, wearing a leather jacket and jeans. But his eyes were cold, calculating, completely devoid of humanity. Mrs. Chen. You're either very brave or very stupid. Probably both. He smiled at that, a thin expression that never reached his eyes. Your son was going to pay me $500,000 to eliminate a problem. The problem got eliminated, but I never got paid. Because Daniel didn't kill her. Someone else did. Not my concern. A contract is a contract. Your son's debt became your debt when he died. I reached into my purse slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements that might spook him. Instead of pulling out money, I produced a small digital recorder. Mr. Torres, what I'm about to tell you might change your perspective on this situation. His hand moved to his jacket, probably reaching for a weapon, but I continued speaking before he could draw it. My son didn't pay you because he changed his mind. 3 days before his death, he decided not to go through with the contract. He was planning to file for divorce and let the courts handle his wife's betrayal. You're lying. He was murdered by the same woman he had hired you to kill, along with her lover Marcus Webb. They're both in prison now, serving life sentences. The debt you think you're owed died with Daniel, because he never completed the transaction. Torres was silent for a long moment, processing this information. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful rather than threatening. You have proof of this? I pulled out copies of the court records, the trial transcripts, the newspaper articles about Cassie and Marcus's convictions. I also had printouts of the emails from Daniel's computer showing his final decision to call off the hit. Torres examined the documents under a small flashlight, his expression growing more puzzled with each page. So the woman he wanted dead killed him instead. That's right. And the money he would have paid you is now funding a foundation that helps families of murder victims. In a way, Daniel's death served justice better than his revenge ever could have. Interesting story. But it doesn't change the fact that I was promised payment for services. Services you never rendered because the client changed his mind. Services I was prepared to render. I did the preliminary work, the surveillance, the planning. That has value. This was the moment I had been preparing for, the reason I had risked everything to meet with a professional killer in an abandoned warehouse. I pulled out an envelope containing $50,000 in cash, money I had withdrawn from the foundation's emergency fund. Consider this payment for services not rendered, I said. Compensation for your time and planning, plus something extra for your discretion in never contacting me or my family again. Torres took the envelope and counted the bills quickly, efficiently. When he finished, he looked up at me with something that might have been respect. You know, Mrs. Chen, in 30 years of doing this kind of work, no one has ever offered to pay me for a job I didn't complete. I'm not paying you for the job. I'm paying you to go away and stay away. Fair enough. He tucked the money into his jacket. Consider our business concluded. You won't be hearing from me again. As he turned to walk away, I called after him, Mr. Torres? That recorder has been running this entire time. If anything happens to me or anyone in my family, the police will have everything they need to connect you to this meeting and to Daniel's original revenge plot. He paused, his back still turned to me. Smart lady. Your son should have thought of that. Then he disappeared into the shadows between the shipping containers, and I was alone on the pier with my racing heart and the knowledge that I had just paid $50,000 to a contract killer, and somehow walked away alive. The drive home was a blur of adrenaline and relief. I had gambled everything on the assumption that Vincent Torres was a businessman first and a killer second, that he would see the logic in taking payment for work not done rather than pursuing a revenge that would only lead to more complications. I had been right, but it was the kind of gamble that could have gotten me killed if I'd been wrong about his character. When I walked into my house at 2 a.m, Trevor was sitting in my living room with 3 other members of my security team, all of them looking ready to commit murder themselves. Do you have any idea how worried we've been? Trevor demanded, jumping up from the couch. When your tracking signal disappeared, we thought. I know what you thought. And I'm sorry. But it's over now. I told them about the meeting, about the payment, about Torres's agreement to disappear forever. I showed them the recording, the proof that Vincent Torres had admitted to planning Daniel's murder and had accepted payment to never contact our family again. Ruth, what you did was incredibly dangerous and probably illegal, Trevor said when I finished. But it was also brilliant. You solved a problem that could have dragged on for years. The FBI wasn't quite as understanding. Agent Morrison spent 2 hours grilling me about the meeting, the payment, and my decision to negotiate with a known criminal without police backup. But in the end, even she had to admit that my approach had worked. We've been trying to get evidence against Vincent Torres for 15 years, she said grudgingly. That recording you made is the first time we've ever gotten him to admit to planning a murder. It might not be enough to convict him for Daniel's case, but it's something. More importantly, the threat was over. Torres kept his word. There were no more surveillance attempts, no more mysterious phone calls, no more men following me home from the grocery store. Whatever debts he thought he was owed had been settled, and he had moved on to other business. For the first time in months, I was able to live without looking over my shoulder. The foundation continued its work, helping families navigate the justice system and rebuild their lives after violent crime. I was able to sleep through the night without jumping at every sound, able to work in Daniel's garden without wondering if someone was watching from the shadows. But the experience had changed me in ways I was still trying to understand. I had stared down a contract killer and lived to tell about it. I had paid blood money to protect my family and felt no guilt about it. I had discovered reserves of courage and cunning I never knew I possessed. Daniel would have been proud of me, I think. Not for the violence or the illegal payment, but for the willingness to do whatever it took to protect the people I loved and the causes I believed in. In the end, that's what this whole story has been about. The lengths we'll go to for love, for justice, for the memory of those we've lost. Some people choose violence and revenge. Others choose forgiveness and service. I chose to honor my son by protecting his legacy and helping others avoid the pain our family had endured. And if that meant occasionally making deals with devils, well, nobody ever said justice was simple. Now we come to the moment you've all been waiting for. The will reading that Cassie was so confident about, the one she thought would make her rich and leave me with nothing. By the time it actually happened, she was already in prison, of course. But her lawyer still showed up, still tried to present that fake will, still believed he was about to witness the greatest legal swindle in the county's history. He had no idea he was walking into a trap. The real will reading took place on a cold Tuesday morning in November, nearly 3 years after Daniel's death. Present were myself, Mr. Whitman, Detective Martinez, FBI Agent Morrison, and a very nervous attorney named Stanley Bridges who represented Cass's interests. Mr. Bridges had requested this meeting after discovering what he believed to be inconsistencies in the probate records. He'd found references to the fake will Cassie had created and was convinced that some kind of administrative error had resulted in the wrong document being accepted by the court. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses nervously, "I believe there has been a serious mistake in the handling of Mr. Daniel Chen's estate." He pulled out a copy of the forged will, the same document that had been found in Cassie's purse on the day of her arrest. Somehow, despite all the evidence of fraud and murder, he still believed it was genuine. According to this document, properly executed and witnessed, Mrs. Cassie Chen should have inherited the majority of her late husband's estate. Instead, probate records show that everything went to his mother. Mr. Whitman looked at Detective Martinez, who nodded slightly. They had decided beforehand to let Mr. Bridges make his full presentation before revealing the truth. "I've examined the signatures," Bridges continued, "and they appear authentic. I've consulted handwriting experts who confirm that this is indeed Mr. Chen's signature. I believe the will that was probated is either a forgery or an earlier version that should have been superseded by this more recent document." It was an impressive performance, really. If I hadn't known the truth, if I hadn't seen Cassie create that fake will with my own eyes, I might have been convinced myself. "Mr. Bridges," Agent Morrison said quietly, "are you aware that your client is currently serving a life sentence for murdering the man whose will you're discussing?" That's a separate matter entirely. Mrs. Chen's criminal conviction doesn't invalidate her civil rights to her husband's estate. It does when she killed him to get that estate." Detective Martinez opened a file folder and spread the contents across the conference table. Photos of the fake will, lab reports showing forged signatures, copies of Cassie's notebook detailing the murder plot. "Mr. Bridges, the will you're holding is a forgery. Your client created it as part of a conspiracy to defraud the estate after murdering Mr. Chen. We have her own handwritten notes describing the process." Mr. Bridges went very pale as he examined the evidence. His hands shook as he turned pages, reading Cassie's detailed plans for creating false documents and eliminating anyone who might expose the fraud. "This can't be right," he whispered. "She told me Daniel had changed his will shortly before his death. She said the family was trying to cheat her out of her rightful inheritance." "She lied," I said simply. "About the will, about the inheritance, about everything. The only truth she ever told was when she confessed to murdering my son." What happened next was something I'll never forget for the rest of my life. Mr. Bridges, a man who had built his entire career on believing his clients and fighting for their rights, realized that he had been completely and utterly deceived. "Dear God," he breathed, slumping back in his chair. "I've spent 2 years fighting to get a murderer the money she killed for." "You didn't know," Mr. Whitman said gently. "Attorneys have to take their client's word about the facts of a case. But I should have investigated more thoroughly. I should have questioned why the signatures looked too perfect, why the witnesses couldn't be located, why the timing was so convenient." He looked up at me with genuine remorse in his eyes. "Mrs. Chen, I am so sorry. I thought I was fighting for justice." "You were fighting for what you believed was right," I replied. "That's not the same as justice, but it's not something to be ashamed of." Mr. Whitman cleared his throat and opened his own file folder. "Now that we've cleared up the matter of the fraudulent will, perhaps we should discuss the actual terms of Daniel's estate." He pulled out the genuine will, the one that left everything to me. But there was more, documents I hadn't seen before, additions Daniel had made in the weeks before his death. "Mrs. Chen, your son made some final amendments to his will in the days before he died. Apparently, he had been considering how to handle his estate if something happened to him, and he wanted to ensure that his wealth would be used for good. Daniel had established something called the Ruth Chen Trust, funded with the majority of his estate and designed to support charitable work in perpetuity. I was named as the primary trustee, with the authority to distribute funds to causes that aligned with Daniel's values. He also left specific instructions," Mr. Whitman continued, "for what should happen if his death was the result of foul play." My heart stopped. What kind of instructions? He established a separate fund, $5 million, to be used for the investigation and prosecution of his killers. He also set aside money for victim assistance programs and legal aid for families who couldn't afford to pursue justice on their own. Daniel had known. Somehow, some way, he had known that Cassie and Marcus were planning to kill him, and he had prepared accordingly. Even in death, even after offering forgiveness to his killers, he had made sure they would face consequences for their actions. "There's one more thing," Mr. Whitman said, pulling out a sealed envelope with my name written on it in Daniel's handwriting. He left this for you, with instructions that it should only be opened after his estate was settled and his killers were brought to justice. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. Mom, if you're reading this, it means I was right about Cassie and Marcus, and it means they succeeded in killing me. I'm sorry you had to go through all of this. I'm sorry I wasn't smart enough or strong enough to stop them before they destroyed our family. I want you to know that I don't blame you for anything that happened. I don't blame you for trusting Cassie, for believing her performance, for not seeing through her lies. She fooled me for years, and I was married to her. You had no reason to suspect that someone could be capable of such evil. I also want you to know that I forgive them. I know that probably sounds crazy, given what they did, but I've learned that holding on to hatred only destroys the person doing the hating. They will face justice for what they've done, I've made sure of that, but I don't want their evil to poison your heart the way it poisoned mine for a while. Use the money to help people. Help families like ours who have been torn apart by violence and greed. Help other people avoid the pain we've all gone through. Make my death mean something by preventing other deaths. But most importantly, don't let this tragedy define the rest of your life. You're 72 years old, Mom, and you deserve to find happiness again. You deserve to laugh and love and live without constantly looking over your shoulder for threats. I love you more than words can express. You made me the man I was, and even though that man wasn't perfect, he was good enough to choose forgiveness over revenge in the end. That's your influence, your values, your love working through me even after death. Be happy, Mom. For both of us. Your son, Daniel. I read that letter 3 times before I could speak through my tears. Daniel had known what was coming, had prepared for it, and had still chosen to face his killers with forgiveness rather than hatred. He really did know, I whispered. The private investigator he hired had uncovered most of their plan, Detective Martinez explained. Daniel knew about the affair, the financial schemes, probably even the murder plot. But instead of going to the police or taking preventive action, he chose to give Cassie one last chance to walk away. And she killed him for it. She killed him for it. Mr. Bridges, who had been sitting in stunned silence throughout this revelation, finally found his voice. Mrs. Chen, I need to ask for your forgiveness too. I spent years trying to take away money that your son wanted you to have, money he set aside specifically to help people like you. You were doing your job. And actually, you helped us in a way you'll never know. How? By forcing us to prove that the will was fake, you gave us additional evidence against Cassie and Marcus. Your investigation helped confirm their guilt. It was a small comfort, but it seemed to ease his conscience somewhat. As we left the law office that morning, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Daniel's death, complete closure. The will reading that Cassie had been so confident about had finally happened, but it had revealed her crimes rather than rewarding them. She had been so sure she would inherit millions of dollars and leave me with nothing. Instead, she was serving life in prison while I controlled a fortune dedicated to helping the innocent and punishing the guilty. If irony was a person, she would have been laughing until she cried. But more than the money, more than the vindication, Daniel's final letter had given me something infinitely more valuable. Permission to be happy again. Permission to stop living in the shadow of his death and start living in the light of his love. The foundation expanded rapidly after the will reading, opening offices in 12 states and helping hundreds of families navigate the justice system. We funded victim advocacy programs, legal aid clinics, and education initiatives designed to help people recognize the warning signs of domestic violence and financial abuse. Every family we helped felt like a victory for Daniel, a way of turning his tragic death into something meaningful and lasting. But I also took his advice about finding happiness again. I started traveling, something I'd always wanted to do but never had time for. I took art classes, learned to play the piano, joined a book club full of interesting people who became genuine friends. I even started dating again, something I never thought I'd do at my age. His name is Walter, he's 78 years old, and he makes me laugh in ways I'd forgotten were possible. Daniel would have liked him, I think. Walter is kind and gentle and completely incapable of deception, which is exactly what I need in my life now. 3 years after Daniel's death, 5 years after meeting Cassie for the first time, I can honestly say that I've found peace. Not the peace of forgetting or moving on, but the peace of knowing that justice was served and that Daniel's legacy lives on through the work of the foundation. Cassie is still in prison, still writing occasional letters trying to justify her actions or paint herself as a victim. I don't read them anymore. I've heard everything she has to say, and none of it changes what she did or who she really is. Marcus died in prison 2 years ago, a heart attack, they said, though there were rumors that his past had caught up with him in the form of another inmate's shiv. I felt no satisfaction in his death, no sense of additional justice being served. His punishment had been life in prison, and death had simply ended that punishment early. Vincent Torres disappeared completely after our meeting at the warehouse. The FBI believes he left the country, probably to somewhere without extradition treaties. I hope he's found whatever peace is available to a man who made his living through violence. But this story isn't really about them anymore. They're footnotes now, cautionary tales about what happens when greed and hatred consume a person's humanity. This story is about surviving the worst thing that can happen to a person and finding ways to turn that survival into something meaningful. It's about learning that justice and revenge aren't the same thing, that healing and forgetting aren't the same thing, and that love can persist even in the face of ultimate betrayal. Most of all, it's about the power of choice. Every day, we choose who to trust, how to respond to pain, what kind of person we want to be. Cassie chose greed over love, violence over patience, deception over honesty. Marcus chose partnership in evil over the possibility of redemption. Daniel chose forgiveness over revenge, even when it cost him his life. And I chose to honor his memory by helping others, by building something good from the ashes of our tragedy, by refusing to let the people who destroyed my family also destroy my capacity for joy. That's the will that really mattered, not the legal document that determined who got the money, but the will to choose light over darkness, hope over despair, love over hate. It's a choice we all have to make, every single day. And it's the most important decision we'll ever face. 5 years have passed since I first heard Cass's voice on the other end of that 3:17 a.m. phone call, and sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago. Sometimes it feels like yesterday. I'm sitting in Daniel's garden as I record this final chapter. My garden now, I suppose, though it will always be his in my heart. The roses he planted are blooming again, their pink and white petals catching the morning sunlight like hope made visible. The foundation is thriving beyond anything I could have imagined when I first conceived it in that lawyer's office, driven by grief and a desperate need to make Daniel's death mean something. We now operate in 37 states, with a staff of 212 people, all dedicated to helping families navigate the aftermath of violent crime. Last month alone, we assisted 63 families with legal representation, provided financial support to 4 to 7 victims while their cases worked through the courts, and our education programs reached over 10,000 people with information about recognizing and preventing domestic violence. But the numbers, as impressive as they are, don't tell the real story. The real story lives in the individual families we've helped. People like Maria Santos, whose husband was murdered by business partners trying to steal his construction company. Like Robert Kim, whose elderly mother was killed by a caregiver who forged her will to steal her savings. Like the Thompson children, whose father was murdered by their stepmother for insurance money in a case so similar to ours it made my blood run cold. Each family that walks through our doors carries the same shell-shocked expression I must have worn in those early days after Daniel's death. The look of people whose world has been turned upside down by someone they trusted, people who are learning for the first time that evil doesn't always come from strangers in dark alleys. Sometimes it comes from the person sleeping next to you, eating breakfast across from you, accepting your love while planning your destruction. We help them navigate the legal system. Yes. We provide financial assistance when insurance companies drag their feet or when lengthy trials drain family savings. But more than that, we help them understand that they're not alone, that others have walked this path before them and found their way back to something resembling peace. Trevor still works with us, running our investigation division. He's 64 now, talks about retirement, but I don't think he'll ever actually stop working. This job saved him, just like it saved me, gave us both a purpose beyond our own pain, a reason to get up every morning and fight for something bigger than ourselves. Walter, yes, I mentioned him before, has become an unexpected partner in this work. As a retired accountant, he helps families understand the financial implications of their cases, walks them through insurance claims and estate proceedings with the patience of someone who genuinely cares about getting things right. He also makes a mean beef stew and can fix almost anything that breaks around the house, which are skills I've come to appreciate more than I ever thought possible. We've been together for 3 years now, and I still sometimes feel guilty about finding happiness again. Not because I think Daniel wouldn't want me to be happy. His final letter made his feelings on that subject very clear. But because happiness feels like a betrayal of the severity of what happened, like I'm somehow diminishing the magnitude of my loss by allowing joy back into my life. My therapist, yes, I finally started seeing someone after Walter gently suggested that carrying all this alone might not be necessary. Says this guilt is normal, that many survivors struggle with the idea that they're allowed to heal. She reminds me that honoring the dead doesn't require living in perpetual grief, that the best way to remember someone is to embrace the values they held dear. Daniel valued kindness, forgiveness, service to others, and the belief that everyone deserves a second chance. The foundation embodies all of those values. My relationship with Walter embodies them too, his patient love helping me remember that trust is still possible, that not everyone is hiding secret motives, that sometimes a person's kindness is exactly what it appears to be. But I haven't forgotten the lessons I learned during those dark months when I lived with my son's killer. I still pay attention to inconsistencies in people's stories. I still trust my instincts when something feels wrong. I still keep detailed records and maintain security precautions that probably seem excessive to people who haven't been through what I've experienced. The difference is that I no longer live in constant fear. I'm cautious without being paranoid, careful without being consumed by suspicion. I've learned to balance healthy skepticism with the openness required for meaningful relationships. Cassie writes to me occasionally, not as often as she used to, but still more than I'd prefer. Her letters have evolved over the years from angry denial to bargaining to what might be genuine remorse, though with her it's hard to tell where manipulation ends and authentic emotion begins. Her most recent letter, received just last month, was different from the others. Ruth, I know you probably won't read this, and I understand why. But I wanted you to know that I've been following the news about your foundation, reading about the families you've helped. I see what you've built from the ashes of what I destroyed, and I don't know if proud is the right word, coming from me, but I'm something close to it. I've been teaching literacy classes here in prison. Yes, I know how ironic that sounds, given how many lies I told. But working with women who never had the chances I threw away has helped me understand something about redemption, about the possibility of becoming better than what you were. I'll never be able to undo what I did to Daniel, or to you, or to your family. I'll never be able to repair the trust one destroyed or restore the life I took. But maybe, in some small way, helping other women in here learn to read and write and dream of better futures is a way of honoring the man I should have loved instead of killing. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that your example, the way you turned your pain into purpose, has inspired someone who never thought she could be inspired again. Your son would be proud of what you've built. He would be proud of who you've become. And maybe, if there's any justice in the universe, he somehow knows that his death led to something beautiful. Cassie. I did read that letter, obviously. And for the first time in 5 years, I actually believed that the person who wrote it might be capable of genuine remorse, genuine change. Not forgiveness. I'm not ready for that, may never be ready for that. But recognition that even people who commit monstrous acts retain some capacity for growth, for understanding the true weight of what they've done. It doesn't change anything, of course. Daniel is still dead. Our family is still broken. The years we should have had together are still gone forever. But it offers a tiny window of hope that maybe, somewhere in the wreckage of all this tragedy, some good might eventually come even from the person who caused it. Marcus Webb, as I mentioned, died in prison. No letters from him, no deathbed confessions, no evolution toward redemption. Some people, I suppose, are beyond saving. The foundation recently established a scholarship program at the local community college, offering free tuition to children who have lost parents to violent crime. The first recipient was a young woman named Sarah whose mother was murdered by an abusive ex-boyfriend. Sarah wants to become a victim's advocate, to help other families the way we helped hers. At the scholarship ceremony, she gave a speech that brought tears to my eyes. People always ask how I can stand to work in this field, how I can surround myself with reminders of the worst thing that ever happened to me. But what they don't understand is that this work isn't about dwelling in the past. It's about building a future where fewer families have to go through what mine did. It's about taking the worst experience of your life and using it to make sure other people don't have the same experience. That's exactly right. That's exactly what Daniel would have said if he were here to see it. The garden where I'm sitting now has become something of a pilgrimage site for Foundation clients. Not officially, of course, but word has gotten around that this is where it all started, where a grieving mother first decided to fight back against the forces that had destroyed her family. Families come here sometimes, not for formal meetings but just to sit among the roses and talk about their own struggles, their own paths toward healing. I always invite them to stay for lunch when that happens. Walter has gotten quite good at making sandwiches for unexpected guests, and there's something therapeutic about breaking bread with people who understand your pain without needing